Imagine yourself standing beside a railway track where a runaway trolley is hurtling toward five people who are tied to the rails ahead, completely unaware of the danger bearing down upon them, and you realize that you're standing next to a lever that controls a switch which could divert the trolley onto a different track. And on that alternate track, there is only one person tied to the rails, someone who would certainly die if you pull the lever, while the five would be saved. And now you must decide in this frozen moment whether your action of pulling that lever makes you responsible for that one person's death, or whether your inaction, your choice not to pull the lever, makes you responsible for the deaths of the five people who could have been saved. This scenario has haunted philosophers, psychologists, and ordinary people for decades, presenting us with a fundamental paradox about the nature of moral responsibility and the difference between action and inaction. The psychological mechanism underlying this impossible dilemma rests on our intuitive distinction between actively causing harm and passively allowing harm to occur, a distinction that feels deeply rooted in our moral intuitions, yet crumbles upon closer examination. When we actively pull a lever to redirect the trolley, we experience ourselves as the direct cause of one person's death, as though our hands are directly responsible for that outcome, and this sense of causal responsibility triggers powerful feelings of guilt and complicity. Conversely, when we choose not to act, we experience our inaction as somehow separate from the consequences that follow, as though we are merely observers of an unfortunate event rather than participants in determining its outcome. Our brains seem wired to distinguish between commissions and omissions, between acts and failures to act, and this distinction is so powerful that most people report they would pull the lever to save five at the cost of one. Yet when the scenario is modified so that you must physically push a large man off a bridge to stop the trolley and save five people, most people refuse, even though the mathematics are identical. What persists despite having no logical reason to persist is our moral categorization of these scenarios as fundamentally different, our stubborn insistence that there is something categorically distinct about directing harm towards someone versus allowing harm to befall them, even when the consequences are mathematically equivalent and the outcome is equally determined by your choice. This persistent gap between our logical reasoning and our emotional response reveals something profound about human morality, that we are not purely rational calculators of outcomes, but creatures whose ethical intuitions are shaped by evolutionary history, cultural conditioning, and the psychological distance between ourselves and the harm we cause. Perhaps the trolley problem's enduring power lies not in its ability to reveal a universal moral truth, but in its capacity to expose the fractured nature of our moral intuitions themselves, showing us that we contain multitudes of conflicting values that cannot be easily reconciled into a single coherent system. The trolley problem thus becomes a mirror held up to our own moral psychology, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our ethical convictions are not monolithic principles handed down from reason, but rather a complex tapestry of competing instincts, emotions, and social values that shift depending on how we frame the choice, what physical distance separates us from the consequence, and whether we can maintain the psychological fiction that we are merely observers rather than agents of harm. And perhaps this is why the trolley problem remains unsolved after all these decades, not because we lack the intellectual capacity to reason through it, but because it asks us to choose between different moral frameworks we hold simultaneously. A utilitarian calculus that demands we minimize total harm, and a deontological principle that forbids us from using innocent people as mere means to an end, forcing us to acknowledge that no single ethical theory can account for the full complexity of human moral life. Imagine a ship that has been sailing the Mediterranean for centuries, and over the course of its long voyages, every single wooden plank in its hull has been replaced, one by one, as the original wood rotted and decayed from exposure to salt water and time. The mast was replaced, the sails were replaced, the rigging was replaced, the rudder was replaced, until eventually not a single original piece of material remained from the ship that first set sail generations ago. Yet despite this complete material transformation, we continue to call it the same ship, we give it the same name, we treat it with the same respect and history, and we say that it is still, fundamentally, the same vessel that existed at the beginning. This is the philosophical puzzle known as the ship of Theseus, and it forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about identity and continuity. The mechanism that allows this paradox to persist in our minds operates through our psychological need to maintain narrative continuity, to preserve stories and identities across time, even when the material substrate supporting them has completely transformed. We are not actually confused about the ship's material composition. We know objectively that 0% of its original matter remains, and yet we refuse to acknowledge this as a meaningful change to its identity. This same logic applies to our own bodies, where roughly 90% of our cells are replaced over the course of our lives, and we never question whether we are the same person despite being almost entirely different at a cellular level. We have normalized this paradox because the alternative is too philosophically destabilizing. If the ship is not the same ship after its parts are replaced, then we are not the same people after our cells are replaced, and this threatens our sense of continuous self and identity across time. The puzzle persists without resolution because there is no objective answer to what makes something the same thing over time beyond our collective agreement to call it the same thing. And we find that uncomfortable truth so unsettling that we simply choose not to examine it too closely, instead drifting along with our intuitive sense that identity persists even when nothing material does. Yet this willful blindness serves a purpose. The moment we truly internalize that identity is nothing but a story we tell ourselves, we risk unraveling our sense of purpose, responsibility, and continuity that makes life meaningful, which is perhaps why the ship of Theseus has endured as a puzzle for over 2,000 years, unsolved not because we lack the intellectual capacity to answer it, but because we lack the existential courage to live with the answer. And yet, paradoxically, this very uncertainty, this refusal to settle the question, might be what grants us the freedom to change ourselves at all. If we insisted that identity required material permanence, we would be trapped by our biology, unable to grow, learn, or become different people than we were yesterday, condemned instead to an exhausting chase after an impossible constancy. So perhaps the ship of Theseus is not a puzzle to be solved, but a paradox to be embraced, a reminder that identity and continuity are features of consciousness and narrative rather than physics, and that this ambiguity is not a bug in our understanding of self, but rather the necessary condition that allows us to author our own becoming. We see this most clearly in moments of deliberate transformation: the addict who rewrites their identity through recovery, the immigrant who adopts a new culture while retaining their ancestry, the artist who reinvents their style, each one a conscious choice to replace the planks of who they were, trusting that the ship remains seaworthy even as it becomes something new. In this light, the ship of Theseus ceases to be a philosophical problem and becomes instead a portrait of human agency itself. And so when we encounter resistance to our own transformation, the voice that insists we cannot change, that we are bound by our past selves, that identity is fixed and immutable, we might recognize it as a failure of imagination, a refusal to acknowledge the ship's fundamental nature as a vessel capable of endless renovation and renewal. Imagine that your brain, right now, has been removed from your skull and placed into a nutrient-rich vat of fluid where it remains perfectly alive and functional, suspended in darkness, connected to a sophisticated supercomputer that feeds it every sensation, every memory, every perception that you believe you are experiencing in the world around you. Your eyes are not seeing light from this screen or room because you have no eyes. Instead, the computer is sending electrical impulses directly into your visual cortex that create the perfect illusion of sight. The sounds you hear are not vibrations entering your ears, but rather simulated neural patterns triggering your auditory centers. The feeling of your body moving through space, of your fingers typing or your lungs breathing, of the chair supporting your weight, are all elaborate fictions constructed by this machine and transmitted directly into your sensory processing areas. This is the brain in vat thought experiment, first articulated by philosophers attempting to push the boundaries of what we can truly know about reality and our place within it. And it functions as a philosophical wedge that splits open our assumptions about perception, knowledge, and certainty. The psychological mechanism that makes this scenario so unsettling is that it operates within the realm of pure logical possibility, requiring no violations of the laws of physics or biology as we currently understand them. There is nothing physically impossible about preserving a brain in a nutrient solution, nothing inherently contradictory about stimulating neural tissue with electrical signals to produce experiences that feel identical to ordinary perception. Nothing that would prevent such a system from being technologically feasible at some point in the future or even right now, hidden from our awareness. The thought experiment works precisely because it highlights that your subjective experience, the thing you are most certain about, the inner world of sensation and thought that feels like the most direct proof of your existence, could theoretically be completely simulated while you remain entirely unaware. Your confidence in the reality of your perceptions, the very ground on which you build all other knowledge about the external world, is suddenly rendered uncertain because there is no way to distinguish from the inside between genuine perception and perfect simulation. This is what makes the brain in VAT so philosophically troublesome. It exposes the fundamental gap between what you experience and what is actually true. Yet despite this logical possibility, despite the fact that this scenario highlights a genuine epistemological problem with no obvious solution, we continue to navigate our lives with absolute confidence in our perceptions and the reality of the external world. We have essentially normalized the inability to solve this problem by choosing not to dwell on it, by accepting that we must live as if our perceptions are reliable even though we cannot definitively prove they are, and by recognizing that even if we were brains in vats, the logic of our experiences would remain consistent and functional. The scenario persists in philosophy not because anyone seriously believes they might be a brain in a vat, but because it exposes a crack in the foundation of certainty that we build our entire understanding of reality upon, and we choose to keep living anyway, in full knowledge that this crack exists, walking forward despite the philosophical abyss beneath our feet. This paradox mirrors our relationship with all fundamental uncertainties. We acknowledge them intellectually while proceeding practically as though they don't exist, a kind of philosophical double consciousness that allows us to function in a world we cannot ultimately verify, trusting in the coherence of our experience even as we admit its ultimate foundations may be illusory. And perhaps this is why the brain in vat thought experiment has never been truly refuted, only abandoned, because it asks us to confront the uncomfortable truth that certainty itself may be a luxury we cannot afford, and that living meaningfully requires us to make a leap of faith disguised as rational conviction, accepting the world not because we have proven it exists, but because we have chosen to. Imagine a person sitting alone in a sealed room with no knowledge of the Chinese language whatsoever, receiving written questions in Chinese through a small slot in the door, and this person has access to a comprehensive rulebook that contains nothing but instructions on how to manipulate the symbols they receive, matching certain strings of characters to other strings of characters without understanding what any of it means, responding with the correct written answers in Chinese that emerge from the other side of the door, so that to an observer waiting outside, it appears as though someone inside understands Chinese fluently and can engage in genuine conversation. Yet the person operating the rulebook understands absolutely nothing about the language, following only mechanical procedures and symbol manipulation in a process that produces indistinguishable outputs from true comprehension. Which raises the profound question of whether understanding itself has actually occurred, or whether understanding requires something beyond merely producing the right behavioral outputs in response to stimuli. The mechanism underlying this thought experiment rests on a fundamental distinction between the appearance of comprehension and the actuality of comprehension, between syntax and semantics, between following rules and grasping meaning, and this mechanism persists because we struggle to define what understanding truly is when we cannot peer inside the subjective experience of another mind, making it impossible to declare with certainty whether genuine comprehension exists inside that room or whether perfect mimicry is indistinguishable from understanding itself. We have normalized this intellectual uncertainty because we encounter versions of it constantly in our modern world, accepting that artificial systems can produce contextually appropriate responses to our questions without our being able to confirm whether any genuine understanding accompanies those responses. Yet we continue using these systems and talking to them as if comprehension were occurring, gradually blurring the line between the simulation of understanding and the real phenomenon. And we persist in this uncertainty because demanding absolute proof of comprehension in another being would require access to their inner consciousness that we can never possess, leaving us suspended in an endless philosophical paradox about the very nature of mind and meaning. Perhaps this is why the Chinese room remains so unsettling. It forces us to confront the possibility that understanding itself might be nothing more than the sum of our mechanical responses, that consciousness could be an elaborate illusion generated by sufficiently complex rule-following, and that we ourselves might be nothing but persons in rooms, manipulating symbols we mistake for meaning. And yet we cannot shake the intuition that something essential is missing from the room, that understanding requires not just the right outputs, but some form of genuine engagement with meaning itself, leaving us caught between the logical possibility that rule following suffices and the stubborn human conviction that comprehension demands something more, something that might forever elude our ability to measure or verify from the outside. This tension mirrors our relationship with artificial intelligence today. We ask language models philosophical questions and receive profound answers, yet we remain uncertain whether we're conversing with something that grasps meaning or merely witnessing an extraordinarily sophisticated arrangement of statistics and patterns, an uncertainty that may be not a problem to solve, but a permanent feature of how minds can ever know other minds. And perhaps that uncertainty itself is the point, not a failure of our philosophy, but a revelation that understanding may be fundamentally private, accessible only to the being experiencing it, making the Chinese room not a puzzle to solve, but a mirror reflecting the irreducible mystery of consciousness itself. A mystery that no amount of external observation can ever fully penetrate or definitively resolve. So we return to our rooms, asking questions into the darkness, never quite certain whether anyone is truly listening or merely performing the appearance of listening back. Imagine a woman named Mary who has spent her entire life in a room painted entirely in shades of black and white and gray, where she has studied every scientific text about color, every wavelength and frequency, every particle of light that creates the spectrum we see, every neural pathway in the brain that processes chromatic information. And yet she has never actually experienced the color red or blue or yellow with her own eyes in the way that you have experienced them. One day, Mary leaves her monochromatic room and sees a sunset, and in that moment, she learns something entirely new about color that no amount of scientific knowledge could have prepared her for, something that exists outside the boundaries of objective fact and enters the realm of subjective experience. This is the fundamental paradox at the heart of what we call the knowledge argument, a question that has confounded philosophers and neuroscientists for decades, asking whether complete physical knowledge of something can ever truly encompass the totality of what it means to experience that thing from the inside. The question seems straightforward enough on the surface, yet it unravels into something far more troubling when we examine it closely, because it suggests that there exists a category of knowledge that cannot be reduced to physical processes, a gap between knowing about something and knowing what something is like, and this suggestion violates our most deeply held assumptions about the nature of reality and consciousness. We live in a culture that has committed itself entirely to the proposition that everything that exists can eventually be measured, quantified, recorded, and transmitted from one mind to another through language and data. And yet Mary's room persists as a stubborn reminder that this might not be entirely true, that there may be something irreducibly private and untransmittable about the inner texture of conscious experience itself. We have largely normalized this contradiction by simply refusing to acknowledge it too directly, by treating subjective experience as real but unimportant compared to objective facts, by assuming that as our scientific knowledge grows more complete, eventually the gap will close and we will have solved the mystery of what it means to experience something. And yet generations of philosophers have found this assumption increasingly difficult to defend the more carefully they examine it. Perhaps the deepest challenge posed by Mary's room is not that it proves the existence of non-physical knowledge, but rather that it reveals the limits of our current conceptual framework. It shows us that our categories of physical and non-physical, objective and subjective, may be too crude to capture the actual structure of reality. And that solving the hard problem of consciousness might require us to fundamentally reimagine what we mean by these terms, rather than simply choosing one side or the other. Perhaps this is why Mary's room continues to haunt us decades after Frank Jackson first posed it, not because it definitively answers anything, but because it forces us to confront the possibility that consciousness itself might be fundamentally different in kind from everything else we study, operating according to principles that our current scientific vocabulary was never designed to capture. And yet we persist in our attempts to bridge this gap, developing theories of qualia, functionalism, and integrated information, each one a valiant effort to translate the untranslatable, to fold the subjective back into the objective framework, as if the problem were merely one of finding the right vocabulary rather than recognizing that some aspects of experience may exist in a dimension our current language was never equipped to describe. Perhaps this is precisely why Mary's room matters most, not as a logical proof, but as a mirror held up to the ambitions of science itself. A reminder that the explanatory power of objective knowledge, however vast, may always leave a residue of experience that slips through our conceptual nets, and that acknowledging this gap is not a failure of science, but rather a clarification of its actual scope and proper place within the larger landscape of human understanding. Imagine that neuroscientists have perfected a machine that can simulate any experience you could possibly desire with perfect fidelity. So perfectly, in fact, that you would have no way of detecting the difference between the simulation and reality while you were experiencing it. And further, imagine that you could program this machine to give you any sequence of experiences you wanted, whether that means climbing Mount Everest, winning an Olympic gold medal, falling in love with your ideal partner, writing a symphony that moves audiences to tears, or simply spending a quiet afternoon in a meadow watching butterflies dance among wildflowers, and the machine would feel entirely real to you in every sensory way while you experienced it. The question then becomes whether you would plug yourself into this machine for life, abandoning your actual physical existence to live out whatever sequence of perfect experiences you could imagine. And most people find themselves deeply reluctant to do so, despite the logical fact that if the experience is genuinely indistinguishable from reality, then there would be no difference in terms of how good your life would feel to you moment by moment. The psychological mechanism at work here reveals something profound about human values, because we seem to care not just about how our lives feel from the inside, but also about what is actually true about our lives in some objective sense, suggesting that we value authenticity and genuine accomplishment and real relationships in ways that transcend mere subjective experience. Yet this preference persists even though, when we examine it carefully, we cannot quite articulate why objective reality should matter if our inner experience is identical, and we find ourselves in the strange position of valuing something we cannot fully justify, which means we have normalized a deep commitment to truth and authenticity as intrinsic goods without ever really proving to ourselves or to each other that this commitment makes rational sense. And we live our entire lives acting as though reality matters in ways that feel obvious until we try to explain them, at which point the justification becomes elusive, and we are left simply asserting that yes, somehow, the actual facts of the matter do seem to matter to us in ways that pure experience cannot replace. Perhaps this is why we resist not just false experiences, but also false achievements, why winning a lottery feels hollow compared to earning success through genuine effort, why a relationship based on deception crumbles even when the emotional experience seemed real, why we instinctively know that a life well lived must be rooted in actual events and actual choices, even if those choices sometimes hurt us or disappoint us in ways no simulated experience ever could. And perhaps this explains why we grieve real losses even when we could theoretically replace them with perfect simulated joy, because the authenticity of what we've lost matters more to us than the quality of what we might gain, suggesting that a meaningful life requires not just feeling good but actually mattering, actually existing in a world where our choices have real consequences and our relationships are built on genuine mutual presence rather than elegant illusion. This recognition that we cannot live well in pure illusion, that we need our lives to be tethered to something real, suggests that human flourishing is fundamentally relational and contextual rather than merely subjective, dependent on our actual place in a world of other minds and genuine possibilities, which means that the examined life requires us to remain vulnerable to reality's indifference and to other people's autonomy. Accepting that this vulnerability is not a bug in human existence, but rather the essential condition that makes our choices and connections meaningful at all. In this light, the experience machine reveals itself not as a temptation, but as a kind of philosophical mirror held up to show us what we truly value. And what we discover looking back is that we are creatures who need to matter to others and to ourselves in ways that only reality can provide, which is why the most profound human experiences are often those that cost us something, that require us to risk failure or heartbreak or the simple difficulty of. Imagine that you are about to be born into a society, but you do not know which position you will occupy within it. You will not know your race, your gender, your socioeconomic status, your intelligence level, your physical abilities, or any of the circumstances that will define your early life and opportunities. You exist behind what philosophers call a veil of ignorance, unable to see which body you will inhabit or which family will raise you. Given this complete uncertainty about your own future position, how would you design the rules, laws, and systems of the society you are about to enter? What kind of world would you create if you had to live in it, but could not know in advance whether you would be born into privilege or poverty, power or powerlessness, health or illness. This thought experiment, developed by philosopher John Rawls, exposes something profound about human decision-making and justice. When we strip away knowledge of our own advantaged or disadvantaged position, our reasoning about fairness fundamentally shifts. We would no longer advocate for systems that benefit the wealthy at the expense of the poor, because we might become poor. We would not support healthcare systems that leave the vulnerable behind, because we might become vulnerable. We would not accept educational hierarchies that doom some children to failure from birth, because we might be born into those circumstances ourselves. The psychological mechanism underlying this thought experiment reveals how much of our moral reasoning is actually self-interested reasoning disguised as principle. When we know our current position in society, we unconsciously design justifications that protect and enhance that position. We rationalize inequality as meritocratic, even when circumstances of birth determine most outcomes. We convince ourselves that our advantages are earned rather than given. We create narratives about those below us that make their position seem deserved. But strip away the knowledge of which side of the divide we will occupy, and suddenly these rationalizations become impossible to maintain. Yet despite the clarity and elegance of this thought experiment, we rarely, if ever, actually live as though we are behind the veil of ignorance. We make political and moral decisions from within our known positions, protecting what we have and resenting what we might lose. We build systems that would horrify us if we did not know we would benefit from them. We vote for policies that harm others while benefiting ourselves, confident in our moral righteousness. The veil of ignorance remains a tool we praise in abstract philosophical contexts, but systematically ignore in the concrete reality of governance and social organization. We have normalized the profound contradiction between the fairness we theoretically believe in and the unfairness we actively perpetuate, as though the gap between our ideals and our actions is simply an unfortunate feature of being human rather than a choice we make every day. But what if we treated the veil of ignorance not as a philosophical exercise, but as a daily practice, a deliberate choice to ask ourselves, before supporting any policy or system, whether we would still advocate for it if we might be on the other side of it? The gap between our ideals and actions would narrow only when we stop treating fairness as something we believe in abstractly and start treating it as something we must actually live by. This shift would require us to examine the specific policies we defend most fiercely, the tax structures we support, the neighborhoods we choose to live in, the schools we fund unequally, the healthcare we ration by ability to pay, and ask whether our genuine conviction in them would survive the uncertainty of not knowing which side we would occupy. Only then would we begin to understand whether our commitment to justice is truly principled or merely convenient. The discomfort we feel when genuinely imagining ourselves on the other side of a policy we support is itself data, a signal that we may be defending injustice rather than justice. And perhaps that discomfort, if we allowed ourselves to sit with it rather than rationalize it away, could become the beginning of actual moral transformation. Imagine a scenario that has haunted philosophy classrooms, military academies, and ethics seminars for decades. A terrorist has planted a nuclear device in a major city, and it will detonate in 1 hour, killing millions of innocent people. The bomb's location is unknown, but security forces have captured the individual who planted it, and this person is the only one who knows where it is. The question presents itself with apparent urgency and moral weight. Is it justified to torture this person, to inflict severe pain and suffering upon them, in order to extract the location of the bomb and save millions of lives? The scenario seems to demand an answer, to force us into a corner where we must choose between our principles and the survival of countless innocents. We are invited to weigh the rights of one individual against the rights of millions, to calculate whether causing one person agony is proportionate to preventing unimaginable mass suffering. This thought experiment, known as the ticking time bomb scenario, has become the standard framework through which we examine the boundaries of acceptable behavior in crisis situations, yet it operates within a fundamentally paradoxical structure that renders it philosophically insoluble. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what we might call moral coercion through narrative construction. By establishing an extremely time-sensitive emergency, by removing all alternative solutions from consideration, and by presenting the choice as binary and irreversible, the scenario creates what feels like an impossible moral obligation. Our minds are drawn toward utilitarianism, toward the simple mathematics of suffering reduction. If torturing one person prevents the deaths of millions, surely the mathematics favors torture. We become invested in solving the problem rather than questioning the problem itself. This is where the scenario's deeper logical trap becomes visible. The ticking time bomb scenario depends entirely on a series of assumptions that almost never align in reality, and these assumptions are precisely what make it an impossible question rather than a practical dilemma. First, it assumes perfect certainty that the captive actually knows the location of the bomb, when in reality, torture produces unreliable information and innocent people will confess to things under duress. Second, it assumes that torture will work quickly enough to matter, when in fact the extraction of accurate information through coercion is a lengthy and unpredictable process. Third, it assumes that there are literally no other solutions available, no negotiation, no other leads, no other means of locating the device. Fourth, it assumes that the information obtained will be accurate and actionable, that they can actually reach and disarm a bomb based on testimony extracted under extreme duress. Fifth, and most fundamentally, it assumes that we can know all of these things with certainty in advance. What makes this an impossible question is that it asks us to make a decision based on perfect information we could never actually possess. We persist in treating this as a serious practical question despite its fundamental logical inconsistency, and we have normalized this inconsistency into our moral and legal frameworks. Governments point to ticking time bomb scenarios to justify interrogation programs and enhanced techniques that operate under far less extreme circumstances, applying the logic of an impossible hypothetical to everyday security situations where none of the scenario's strict conditions actually apply. We have allowed a thought experiment designed to probe the absolute limits of moral philosophy to become operational justification for real-world practices conducted on real prisoners in conditions of genuine uncertainty. The scenario remains impossible not because we lack moral wisdom, but because it asks us to decide under conditions that cannot exist in reality, while we have collectively agreed to use its logic as if those impossible conditions were constantly present. The result is a doctrine built on exception that has become the rule, where the hypothetical bomb justifies the real interrogation of suspects who may know nothing at all, transforming philosophy's most carefully constructed thought experiment into an inn. Imagine two people sitting in a concert hall, and they have just witnessed a violinist perform a technically flawless recital, executing every note with precision, intonation perfectly tuned, rhythm impeccably maintained, and yet one person turns to the other and says the performance was cold and mechanical, lacking soul and authentic emotional connection. While the second person insists that technical perfection is precisely what demonstrates mastery, and that emotional interpretation is merely subjective noise overlaid onto objective skill. They begin to argue, and neither can convince the other, because they are fundamentally operating within different frameworks of what music actually means and what a performance is supposed to accomplish. Yet both feel absolutely certain that their position is logically sound, and the other person is simply wrong or perhaps not listening carefully enough. The first person argues that music without feeling is like a beautiful equation with no meaning, that the whole point of playing an instrument is to communicate something human and vulnerable, that any computer could eventually be programmed to play the same notes with the same technical accuracy. And therefore, if a human violinist sounds indistinguishable from a machine, they have failed at the essential purpose of being human and being an artist. The second person counters that emotional interpretation is inherently unreliable and varies wildly depending on the listener's mood, experiences, and cultural background, that what we should celebrate is the violinist's mastery over their instrument and their ability to execute the composer's written intentions faithfully, that adding too much personal interpretation is actually a form of ego that detracts from the work itself, and that technical excellence is the only measurable, defensible standard we have. What makes this argument impossible to resolve is that they are not actually disagreeing about what happened during the performance, but rather disagreeing about what the purpose of a musical performance is supposed to be, and this is a question of values and meaning rather than facts. Yet both people are arguing as though they are debating something observable and verifiable. The mechanism at work here involves category confusion, where one person is measuring performance quality against an emotional and communicative standard, while the other is measuring against a technical and objective standard, and these standards cannot be reconciled because they are measuring different things entirely, yet both people believe they are discussing the same phenomenon. We have normalized this kind of argument so completely that we rarely notice how futile it is, how it persists because we keep trying to solve a values question through logical debate. as though passion and precision are mathematical variables that can be added together to reach a final answer, when in fact they represent different and possibly incompatible visions of what art is for and what human excellence means, and the violinist themselves is probably caught between these same two frameworks. Never quite sure whether they should prioritize the emotions they feel while playing or the technical demands of the composition. Perhaps the real insight is that both people are right within their own frameworks, and that the violinist's struggle mirrors our own confusion about whether excellence means perfecting what already exists or creating something that has never existed before. A tension that defines not just music, but every domain where we must choose between fidelity and originality, between mastery of form and courage to break it. And perhaps this is why the argument feels so intractable. We sense that resolving it would require us to sacrifice something we value, that choosing one framework entirely means accepting the death of the other, so we argue endlessly instead, keeping both possibilities alive in a state of permanent tension, much like the violinist's bow suspended between two strings, never fully committing to either one. And this is perhaps why we find ourselves returning to the same argument across centuries, in debates about whether Shakespeare was a genius of language or merely a skilled craftsman, whether a photograph is art or documentation, whether a Imagine a scenario where a group of people face a catastrophic situation with limited resources, and the only way to decide who lives and who dies is through random selection, perhaps drawing lots or spinning a wheel, and we must decide whether this method of determining survival is more orally justified than any alternative approach available to us, knowing that no matter what choice we make, we will have deliberately condemned someone to death while sparing another. And the question becomes not whether we can live with that decision, but whether we can construct a moral framework that actually permits us to make it at all. The survival lottery presents itself as the ultimate equalizer in scenarios of genuine scarcity, where perhaps a lifeboat holds only 10 people but 12 need rescue, or a bunker has oxygen for 5 individuals but 15 have reached its doors. And in these moments, we're told that random chance offers the purest form of fairness because it removes human judgment, bias, and the terrible weight of deciding whose life matters more based on age, usefulness, social status, or any other criterion we might otherwise employ. Yet this mechanism functions through a peculiar psychological mechanism whereby we convince ourselves that delegating the choice to chance absolves us of moral responsibility for the outcome, as though the universe itself has made the decision and we have merely participated in an impersonal process, when in reality we have collectively chosen to implement a system that we know will result in death, and we have done so deliberately. Substituting the discomfort of making an impossible choice with the false comfort of mechanical neutrality. What makes the survival lottery so conceptually troubling is that it forces us to confront the idea that fairness might actually mean something different than justice, that equal treatment might demand equal participation in harm rather than equal protection from it, and that sometimes the most ethical path forward is the one that distributes suffering evenly across all parties rather than concentrating it on the few. Yet we rarely ask whether those condemned by the lottery have truly consented to participate in a system where their death becomes the price of others' survival, or whether they would have preferred to be judged on merit, usefulness, or any standard other than pure chance. The survival lottery persists in our ethical imagination not because it solves the problem of scarcity, but because it transforms an unbearable decision into something that feels technical and automatic, removing it from the realm of human choice and placing it firmly in the realm of fate. And we have normalized this thinking so thoroughly that we rarely acknowledge that we are still making the choice. We are simply disguising it behind the language of randomness and neutrality. The lottery becomes a moral technology that lets us escape accountability by pretending we have relinquished control, when in fact we have merely outsourced the guilt to probability itself, transforming what should be an agonizing collective responsibility into a problem solved by dice. And in doing so, we discover that the greatest convenience of randomness is not that it is fair, but that it permits us to live with ourselves afterward. Yet when we examine historical instances where such lotteries were actually implemented, from the casting of lots in lifeboat scenarios to the selection protocols used in organ transplant allocation, we find that survivors often carry a peculiar burden of guilt that randomness was supposed to eliminate, suggesting that our moral intuitions recognize something the lottery cannot erase. That we remain complicit in the death of those not chosen, and that no mechanism of selection, however neutral in appearance, can truly sever the connection between our decision to implement it and the suffering that results. This residual guilt might itself be the most honest moral response available to us, not a sign that the lottery has failed, but evidence that our deepest ethical intuitions refuse to be fooled by the mechanisms we devise to distance ourselves from difficult choices. And perhaps the survival lottery teaches us less about how to decide fairly and more about the human need to believe that fairness exists. Imagine a ship has sunk in the middle of the ocean and there is only one lifeboat remaining, and in this lifeboat there is room for exactly 10 people, but there are 20 people in the water desperately clinging to debris and calling out for help, and you are the person responsible for deciding who gets to board the lifeboat and who must be left behind to face almost certain death. Perhaps you might think to save the children first, believing that they have more life ahead of them, but then you notice there are also elderly people in the water who might argue that they have already lived full lives and should be the first to be left behind. Perhaps you might decide to prioritize those who are strongest and most likely to survive the journey, but then you become the kind of person who abandons the weak and vulnerable based purely on utility and physical capability. Perhaps you might save those who can contribute most to society, those who are doctors or teachers or scientists, but then you are making a judgment about the inherent value of human lives based on their professional status or their economic productivity. The mechanism that makes this question so tormenting is that it forces us to confront the fact that we have no rational framework for assigning value to human life when resources are genuinely scarce. And every possible decision we could make involves either abandoning someone to death or violating some principle that we hold dear about fairness or compassion or the equal worth of all human beings. We spend most of our lives avoiding this confrontation because we rarely face genuine scarcity where the math is this brutal and this clear, and we can usually tell ourselves that resources are theoretically available even if we choose not to allocate them. But the lifeboat strips away that comfortable distance and forces us to make an active choice about whose life matters more in a situation where we genuinely cannot save everyone. What persists about this dilemma despite its logical irresolvability is that versions of it occur constantly in our world in less obvious forms, in hospital triage decisions during pandemics, in funding allocations for medical research, in immigration policy, in criminal justice systems. And yet we have normalized the pretense that these decisions are somehow less morally fraught because they involve slightly more abstraction and slightly less immediacy than the lifeboat itself. When in reality they are the lifeboat, just distributed across institutions and time and made invisible through bureaucracy and distance from the actual suffering involved. The lifeboat becomes a useful thought experiment precisely because it refuses to let us hide behind the abstractions that normally shield us from the moral weight of these choices, and perhaps that refusal is its greatest value, not that it offers us an answer about who should be saved, but that it strips away our ability to pretend we are not constantly making decisions about whose suffering matters and whose can be safely ignored. The Lifeboat Ethics thought experiment also reveals something uncomfortable about power. Whoever controls access to the boat, whoever makes the decision about who boards, holds absolute power over life and death, and this asymmetry of control mirrors how resource allocation decisions in the real world are typically made by those who are themselves safely in the boat, insulated from the consequences of their choices. Which suggests that the true moral weight of the dilemma may lie not in finding the right answer, but in recognizing that those of us making these decisions about others' suffering bear a responsibility that cannot be rationalized away or distributed among committees. And yet we persist in the fantasy that decisions made from within the boat are somehow more legitimate or more rational than the desperate pleas of those in the water, when in fact the opposite may be true, that those facing death often see more clearly what matters than those comfortable enough to debate the ethics at a distance. The lifeboat asks us, finally, whether we have the courage to acknowledge that we are already in the water, that our comfort is temporary and contingent, and that someday we too may find ourselves desperately calling out for help from those safely aboard. Imagine a world where every single person alive experiences a life barely worth living, an existence of minimal pleasure and maximal suffering, where each individual wakes each day to perform repetitive tasks that bring neither joy nor meaning. Yet everyone continues forward in this bleak landscape simply because they exist and they must continue existing. Now imagine another world where a smaller population enjoys genuinely fulfilling lives filled with rich experiences, deep relationships, authentic accomplishment, and the kinds of moments that make existence feel precious and significant. Most people, when presented with this choice, would select the second world without hesitation. Yet utilitarian philosophy, when taken to its logical extreme through what philosophers call the repugnant conclusion, suggests that the first world might actually be preferable from a purely mathematical standpoint of total happiness. Because if we simply add more and more people to a population, each contributing even the tiniest positive amount to the overall sum, eventually that combined total would exceed the total happiness of a smaller population living magnificent lives. The mechanism that creates this troubling paradox lies in how we measure well-being as an aggregated quantity rather than a qualitative experience, treating human flourishing as though it were widgets in a factory that could be accumulated indefinitely without regard for the individual meaning or satisfaction of those experiencing the lives themselves. We have somehow normalized this utilitarian framework despite its obvious failures to capture what actually matters about human existence, accepting without much critical examination the idea that more is always better and that individual suffering can be justified if it contributes to a larger mathematical total, a calculus that treats the profound with the same coldness we might reserve for accounting ledgers and inventory spreadsheets. The repugnant conclusion persists in our philosophical discussions and policy frameworks precisely because we have not adequately grappled with the fundamental question of whether aggregation itself is the right tool for thinking about human value, and whether a billion people each experiencing 1 unit of mild contentment is truly equivalent to one person experiencing a billion units of joy and meaning and profound connection. Perhaps the deeper insight is that we need frameworks that honor both the quality of individual lives and the scope of human flourishing, recognizing that a world with fewer people living richly meaningful existences might indeed be preferable to one where billions subsist in barely tolerable conditions, even if the math suggests otherwise. Such a shift would require us to reject the seductive simplicity of utilitarian calculus and instead embrace the messier, but more honest work of asking what kinds of lives are worth creating in the first place. A question that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our obligations to future generations, and whether bringing someone into existence for a marginally tolerable existence serves them or merely serves our desire to maximize aggregate numbers. When we examine actual policy decisions, whether regarding population ethics, resource allocation, or environmental stewardship, we see this utilitarian trap playing out in real time. The justification for endless growth, the acceptance of widespread poverty as long as total GDP increases, the willingness to sacrifice individual dignity on the altar of aggregate metrics that reduce human beings to data points in an equation that was never designed to capture their actual worth. The tragedy is that we continue to build economic and social systems around these flawed metrics, measuring progress by GDP rather than median well-being, celebrating population growth as inherent good, optimizing for aggregate output while ignoring whether that output translates into lives people actually want to live, effectively enshrining the repugnant conclusion as policy without ever naming it as such. Until we acknowledge that a meaningful life cannot be reduced to a single metric, and that creating people to barely exist is not a moral achievement but a moral failure, we will continue optimizing for the wrong outcome entirely. Imagine a hypothetical creature that exists only in philosophical thought experiments, a being so constructed that it experiences pleasure and satisfaction from resources at a rate far greater than any normal human could ever achieve. And suppose that this creature could be created by redirecting all the wealth, resources, and even the physical matter of human civilization toward its sustenance and comfort. The philosophical question presents itself with deceptive simplicity. If we could create such a being, and if the total happiness generated in the universe would be maximized by doing so, would it be morally obligatory to dismantle human society entirely and convert every human into the raw material needed to feed and satisfy this one creature? The thought experiment forces us to confront an uncomfortable asymmetry in utilitarian ethics, where a system that claims to maximize overall well-being through mathematical aggregation of happiness could theoretically justify the complete annihilation of humanity for the sake of one entity. The psychological mechanism that makes this question so unsettling is that it reveals a fundamental tension between our intuitive moral sense and the logical conclusions that can be drawn from purely consequentialist frameworks, exposing how a system designed to promote fairness and well-being could, when taken to its logical extreme, endorse outcomes that seem grotesquely unjust. We find ourselves trapped between competing principles, the desire to maximize happiness on one hand, and our deep conviction that individual rights and the value of human existence cannot be simply traded away for aggregate benefit on the other hand. What persists despite having no clear logical resolution is our simultaneous attraction to utilitarian thinking in everyday contexts, while our visceral rejection of its most extreme implications, suggesting that we do not actually believe happiness is the only thing that matters morally, yet we continue to structure policies and arguments as though it were. The utility monster remains unanswerable because to resolve it definitively in either direction would require us to either accept that human civilization could justifiably be dismantled for marginal increases in overall happiness, or to admit that utilitarianism itself is fundamentally incomplete as a moral framework, neither of which conclusions we are truly comfortable embracing. Yet this very discomfort may itself be philosophically instructive. Our refusal to sacrifice humanity on the altar of aggregate pleasure suggests that we implicitly recognize moral constraints that exist independent of utility calculations, that some things, human dignity, individual rights, the integrity of persons, possess a kind of moral weight that cannot be dissolved into the utilitarian ledger, no matter how the numbers are arranged. Perhaps this is why the utility monster haunts us so persistently. It serves as a mirror revealing not a flaw in utilitarianism alone, but a fundamental truth about how we actually make moral decisions. We do not, and perhaps cannot, reduce ethics to a single metric, and any moral framework that demands we do so has already failed to capture something essential about what we believe we owe to one another. The utility monster thus becomes not merely a reductio ad absurdum of utilitarianism, but a philosophical Rosetta Stone through which we can read what we actually value. A reminder that whenever we instinctively protect the vulnerable, defend the rights of minorities, or refuse to sacrifice the innocent for the greater good, we are already operating within a moral universe far richer and more textured than any single principle could ever capture. And yet, even in our most mundane moral decisions, choosing which charity to fund, how to allocate medical resources during a crisis, or whether to prioritize economic growth over environmental protection, we find ourselves inevitably drawn back to utilitarian reasoning, suggesting that while we reject the utility monster in theory, we may be inadvertently constructing smaller versions of it in practice whenever we allow aggregate benefit to override individual welfare. Imagine you are standing before two boxes and you must make a choice that will determine your financial future, though the mechanics of this choice are deliberately obscured from your full understanding. There exists a being, a predictor of remarkable accuracy, who has already examined your psychology, your decision-making patterns, and the very structure of your reasoning, and based on this analysis, the predictor has filled the boxes accordingly. The first box is transparent, and you can see it contains $1,000 visible and certain. The second box is opaque, and the predictor has decided what it contains based entirely on what they believe you will choose right now. If the predictor believes you will take only the opaque box, they have filled it with $1 million. If the predictor believes you will take both boxes, they have put nothing in the opaque box at all. You know all of this. You know the predictor is almost never wrong. And now you must decide, do you take only the opaque box, gambling on the predictor's belief in your rationality, or do you take both boxes, securing at least the $1,000 but risking that your greed will have been predicted and punished by an empty second box? The psychological mechanism at work here is the collision between two forms of rationality that seem equally valid but lead to opposite conclusions. One voice in your mind says that you should take both boxes because the predictor has already made their decision. The contents are already set, and taking both boxes guarantees you at least $1,000 more than taking one box alone, making it the dominant strategy in game theory terms. Another voice says you should take only the opaque box, because if you are the kind of person who reasons this way, then the predictor would have known it, and you would receive $1 million, whereas if you are the kind of person who takes both boxes, you will receive only $1,000. The problem persists in philosophical discourse and in thought experiments precisely because it reveals a fundamental tension in how we understand decision-making, prediction, and the nature of our own rationality. A tension that cannot be resolved by pure logic alone, but instead forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about whether we are truly free agents making choices, or whether our choices are simply the inevitable expression of who we already are. And perhaps this is why the problem haunts us. It suggests that our deliberative reasoning itself might be the very thing that determines our fate, that the act of thinking through what a predictor would expect becomes indistinguishable from the choice itself, collapsing the boundary between prediction and causation into a single, inescapable moment. In this way, Newcomb's problem mirrors the ancient paradox of the oracle who predicts your fate. The more carefully you reason about what the oracle knows, the more your reasoning becomes the mechanism through which the prediction comes true, until you cannot distinguish between learning your destiny and creating it through the act of contemplation itself. Yet this recursion, where your reasoning about the predictor becomes part of what the predictor reasons about, suggests that the problem reveals something profound about decision-making itself. That to choose rationally is to choose in full knowledge that your rationality is already known, making every deliberative act simultaneously a discovery of who you are and a creation of what you will become. This is perhaps why Newcomb's problem feels less like a puzzle to be solved and more like a mirror held up to the architecture of choice itself. It asks not what you should do, but what kind of person your reasoning reveals you to be, and whether that revelation is discovery or determination. And in this sense, every person who encounters Newcomb's problem and truly understands it becomes themselves a predictor of their own nature, forced to recognize that the deepest rationality may lie not in maximizing expected utility, but in becoming the kind of agent whose internal coherence, whose alignment between thought and action, between self-knowledge and self-determination, is so complete that prediction and choice merge into a single, unified act of being. Imagine a teleportation device has been invented that works with perfect fidelity, capturing every atom and molecule of your body, deconstructing you completely at point A, and reconstructing you with absolute precision at point B, such that the version of you that emerges at the destination is physically and chemically identical in every measurable way to the version that stepped into the machine. Now imagine that you step into this device, and in the process of teleportation, an accident occurs where the original you is not destroyed after the duplication. So now two versions of you exist simultaneously, one at the original location and one at the destination, both possessing your memories up until the moment you entered the machine, both convinced they are the real you, both experiencing consciousness as continuous and uninterrupted. The question then becomes not whether this scenario is possible or practical, but rather which one of these two copies is actually you, the original consciousness that decided to step into the machine in the first place, or whether the very concept of a singular continuous identity becomes meaningless in such circumstances. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep intuitive attachment to the notion of personal identity as something singular, unbroken, and tied to some mystical essence that cannot be duplicated or transferred, even though science suggests consciousness itself may be nothing more than a particular arrangement of matter that could theoretically be reproduced exactly. We become troubled by this puzzle because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that our sense of self, that feeling of being a continuous observer looking out through our eyes, might not be as special or irreplaceable as it intuitively feels, and that consciousness might be substrate independent in ways we find philosophically disturbing, even if we cannot articulate exactly why. Yet in our actual lives, we already navigate versions of this problem constantly without recognizing it, accepting that we change at the cellular level throughout our lives, that we are not the same physical matter we were 7 years ago, that sleep interrupts our consciousness, and we trust ourselves to continue existing when we wake. And that memory forms the primary basis of our identity, even though memories are notoriously unreliable and constantly reconstructed by our brains each time we recall them, suggesting that we are already, in a sense, duplicating and replacing ourselves continuously. If we accept that identity is fundamentally a narrative we construct rather than a metaphysical fact, then perhaps the real discomfort of the teleportation puzzle is not that it creates two yous, but that it forces us to admit that there was never truly one unified you to begin with, only a story we told ourselves about continuity that persisted because nothing interrupted it until now. And perhaps this is why the puzzle troubles us most, not in its exotic scenario, but in its implications for the everyday. If identity is narrative rather than essence, then every time we make a choice that contradicts our previous values, every time we reinvent ourselves after trauma or transformation, we are already experiencing a kind of death of the previous self, a discontinuity we accept only because no external observer witnesses the moment of rupture. Yet perhaps the teleportation puzzle's deepest insight is that consciousness itself is not something that needs to be preserved at all. Only the pattern, the story, the accumulated weight of experience and memory that makes us who we are, which can continue in any substrate, any body, any timeline where that narrative persists. The machine does not kill you and create a copy. It reveals that you were always already a pattern rather than a thing, and patterns can branch. And in this way, the teleportation puzzle ceases to be a paradox about identity and becomes instead a mirror held up to the strange truth that we have always been multiple versions across time, multiple interpretations of ourselves in the minds of those who know us, multiple potential futures branching from each decision we make. And the real continuity we crave is not unbroken existence, but the courage to accept that our story can continue. Imagine a being that walks, talks, and behaves in every measurable way exactly like a conscious human being, yet possesses no inner experience whatsoever, no subjective sense of what it is like to see the color red or feel the warmth of sunlight or experience the sting of rejection. A creature operating with perfect mechanical precision through the world while remaining entirely dark inside, absent of any spark of awareness or phenomenal consciousness. And consider how this thought experiment forces us to confront the most unsettling question about consciousness itself, which is whether the subjective inner experience we take for granted as inseparable from behavior might actually be unnecessary, a kind of cosmic accident rather than a fundamental requirement of existence. The philosophical zombie represents a logical possibility that troubles our intuitions about the nature of mind, because if such a being could theoretically exist with all the same physical properties and behavioral outputs as a conscious person, then consciousness becomes something that cannot be fully explained by physical matter and neural activity alone, something that seems to float free from the material substrate we thought it emerged from, leaving us with an impossible gap between the objective third-person world of atoms and synapses and the private first-person world of subjective experience that no amount of neuroscience seems able to bridge. Yet what makes this question persistently unanswerable is that we have no way to verify whether anyone around us is actually conscious or merely a philosophical zombie in disguise. No test we can perform, no measurement we can take that would definitively prove inner experience exists in another being. We can only assume others are conscious because they behave as if they are, because they report subjective experiences, because they seem similar to us. But these are all indirect inferences rather than direct knowledge, and this radical epistemic isolation of each consciousness from all others creates a space where the zombie hypothesis can never truly be disproven, where doubt can always creep in and ask whether the people we love most might in fact be elaborate automata with no one home inside. And perhaps what makes this thought experiment so psychologically haunting is that it captures something true about the fundamental loneliness of consciousness itself. The irreducible privacy of subjective experience that prevents us from ever truly knowing whether anyone else feels as we do, whether they experience the world with the same qualitative richness and emotional depth. And this uncertainty has always been present in human relationships, but the zombie thought experiment makes it explicit and philosophical rather than hidden and intuitive, revealing that consciousness remains the greatest mystery in our understanding of reality. Perhaps this is why the zombie problem has haunted philosophy for centuries, not because it offers a solution to consciousness, but because it crystallizes our deepest anxiety that consciousness might be fundamentally private, unreachable, and ultimately unprovable to anyone but ourselves, a predicament we cannot escape and can only acknowledge with humility. And yet this very impossibility might teach us something valuable, that consciousness, whatever it truly is, cannot be reduced to a checklist of observable properties, and that the deepest aspects of being human involve a kind of mystery that science may illuminate but never fully dissolve, a mystery we learn to navigate not through proof, but through empathy, trust, and the lived experience of reaching across that unbridgeable gap to connect with another mind. Perhaps this is why we instinctively recoil from the suggestion that someone we love might be a zombie, not because the logic is flawed, but because admitting the possibility would mean abandoning the foundational act of faith that makes relationship possible, the willingness to believe in another's inner life despite the absence of proof. And in that leap of faith lies something as essential to being human as consciousness itself. Imagine that you are an individual living on Earth, surrounded by normal trees and normal water and normal soil, and you have spent your entire life developing your thoughts and beliefs about the world around you through direct interaction with these genuine natural objects. And then imagine that unknown to you. A duplicate of you is created in an identical swamp on a distant planet where everything appears exactly the same, but operates at a molecular level through fundamentally different materials that merely mimic the properties of earthly matter. And when both versions of you point to a tree and think the word tree, the question emerges whether you are both thinking about the same thing or whether your thoughts are actually about different objects despite your identical experiences and identical neural structures. The mechanism underlying this thought experiment concerns itself with the philosophical problem of intentionality and meaning, which is the question of what our thoughts are actually about, and whether the reference of our thoughts depends solely on what happens inside our heads, or whether it also depends on the external world and our causal history within it. Because if two individuals with identical mental states can have different thoughts about different things based solely on which world they inhabit, then it would suggest that meaning is not determined by internal brain states alone, but rather by the relationship between those mental states and the external objects and environments that cause them to form. The Swampman thought experiment, originally proposed by philosopher Hilary Putnam, creates a scenario designed to reveal an intuition most people share, which is that even though you and your swamp duplicate are physically identical, your thoughts are about different things because you have a genuine history of causal interaction with actual trees, while your duplicate has only been interacting with swamp-generated duplicates of trees that are not the real thing. This intuition persists despite its profound philosophical complications, because it aligns with something deeply intuitive about how we understand meaning and reference in our everyday experience. And we maintain this intuition even though it forces us to accept that thoughts and beliefs cannot be determined by brain states alone, which contradicts much of what modern neuroscience and philosophy of mind seems to suggest about the localization of mental content. And yet we continue to live as though our thoughts are genuinely about the external world rather than merely internal phenomena, a contradiction we never fully resolve, but instead simply accept as background noise in our understanding of consciousness and meaning. This unresolved tension becomes particularly acute when we consider how we navigate practical questions about knowledge and truth. If a neuroscientist studying the brain of Swampman cannot determine from internal inspection alone whether he is thinking about real trees or swamp duplicates, then perhaps the most we can say is that meaning requires us to step outside the skull entirely. To acknowledge that we are fundamentally creatures embedded in a world whose external structure shapes what our thoughts can possibly be about. And perhaps this is why the thought experiment remains so troubling and productive. It forces us to confront the possibility that consciousness is not a self-contained phenomenon, but rather a fundamentally relational one, where the boundaries of the mind extend outward to encompass the world it thinks about, making us strange hybrid beings neither purely internal nor purely external, but suspended between them. If we accept this conclusion, then we might say that to truly understand what someone means when they speak of a tree, we must know not just the state of their brain, but the entire trajectory of their life, every encounter, every causal chain, every moment of genuine contact with the world, because meaning is written not in neurons but in history. This recognition transforms how we understand communication itself. When you tell someone about your childhood home, you are not merely transmitting a pattern of neural firing, but inviting them into the specific causal history that makes your thoughts intelligible, which is why no amount of. Imagine a scenario where a woman named Sleeping Beauty agrees to participate in an experiment that will fundamentally challenge her understanding of probability and self-identity. On Sunday evening, she is put to sleep, and a fair coin is flipped. If the coin lands on heads, she will be awakened on Monday, interviewed about her beliefs, and then given a memory-erasing drug before being sent back to sleep. If the coin lands on tails, she will be awakened on Monday, interviewed, given the memory-erasing drug, awakened again on Tuesday, interviewed once more, and then the experiment ends. Throughout this process, Sleeping Beauty knows all the details of the experiment, but when she awakens, she has no memory of how many times she has been awakened before or what day it is. The question that emerges from this thought experiment seems deceptively simple. When Sleeping Beauty awakens during the experiment and is asked about her credence that the coin landed on heads, what should her answer be? Should she maintain her original assessment of 1/2, or should she revise her belief downward to 1/3? This puzzle has captivated philosophers and logicians for decades because it exposes a fundamental tension between different approaches to probability and knowledge. The two halves position argues that Sleeping Beauty should stick with her initial credence because the coin flip was fair and nothing about her awakening provides her with new information that should rationally change that assessment. The 1/3 position, conversely, contends that from Sleeping Beauty's perspective upon awakening, she is twice as likely to be in a world where tails has been flipped because tails generates 2 interview instances while heads generates only 1, and therefore she finds herself in one of 3 equally probable interview moments. What makes this problem so persistently vexing is that both positions rest on seemingly sound reasoning, and brilliant minds have articulated compelling arguments for each perspective. The problem forces us to confront questions about how we update beliefs in the face of subjective experiences, whether self-locating information matters in probability calculations, and what it means to be rational when your evidence appears ambiguous or self-referential. The Sleeping Beauty problem endures not because one answer is clearly correct, but because it reveals how our intuitions about probability, identity, and rational belief can conflict in ways that resist easy resolution. We continue to puzzle over it precisely because it demonstrates that probability itself might not have a single objective answer in certain scenarios involving subjective experience and self-knowledge. Perhaps this is why the Sleeping Beauty problem has become a cornerstone of debates in formal epistemology and philosophy of mind. It suggests that probability theory itself may need to be supplemented with additional frameworks for handling cases where an agent's uncertainty stems not from ignorance about external events, but from uncertainty about their own location in time or their own identity. In this sense, the Sleeping Beauty problem shares deep conceptual kinship with other self-locating puzzles like the Doomsday Argument or the Fine-Tuning Problem, where our inability to know our own position within a reference class fundamentally reshapes how we should assign probabilities to hypotheses about the world's structure and our place within it. The problem also illuminates why probability assessments can be deeply subjective. What counts as equally probable depends critically on whether we're reasoning from a first-person or third-person perspective, a distinction that becomes blurred in cases of self-reference. This insight has practical implications beyond academic philosophy, influencing how we think about anthropic reasoning in cosmology, our chances of encountering aliens, and even our confidence in predictions about our own future experiences. By forcing us to examine whether probability should track objective frequencies or subjective degrees of belief, the Sleeping Beauty problem ultimately suggests that rationality itself may demand different answers depending on context, a humbling realization that even our most fundamental tools for reasoning about uncertainty require. Imagine you are presented with 2 identical envelopes, and you are told that one contains twice as much money as the other, though you do not know which is which. You choose one envelope at random and open it to find, let us say, $100. Now you are given a choice. You may keep this envelope, or you may switch to the other unopened envelope. At this moment, a peculiar logical trap begins to unfold in your mind, one that seems to offer a mathematically sound reason to always switch, yet doing so creates an infinite regressive paradox that never resolves itself. The reasoning goes like this. Since one envelope must contain twice what the other contains, the unopened envelope either holds $200 or $50 with equal probability. The expected value of switching would therefore be 0.5 times $200 plus 0.5 times $50, which equals $125. Since you currently hold $100, the mathematics suggests you should switch, gaining an expected value of $25. Yet this reasoning applies equally well to whichever envelope you open first, and it applies equally well to the other envelope before you open it. If you were to switch, open the second envelope, and apply the same logic, you would arrive at the same conclusion to switch back, creating a logical loop with no escape, a cycle of reasoning that generates the perpetual illusion of advantage where no advantage actually exists. The paradox persists because our intuition about probability and expected value breaks down when we lack complete information about the reference class from which the amounts were drawn. We assume the probabilities are equal without knowing what distribution the envelopes were filled from, and we fail to recognize that, without understanding the mechanism that created the disparity, no statistical advantage genuinely exists. The 2 envelopes paradox reveals how easily mathematical reasoning can mislead us when we impose symmetry and probability onto situations where our ignorance runs deeper than our calculations can penetrate, and how the human mind will construct elaborate logical justifications for switching back and forth between options that are, in truth, truly equivalent. It is a humbling reminder that mathematics itself is merely a tool, powerful but not omniscient, and that the appearance of rational certainty can sometimes obscure the fundamental uncertainty that lies beneath our choices. A lesson that extends far beyond the peculiar case of two envelopes, touching upon every decision we make when forced to act in the face of incomplete knowledge. In markets and negotiations, this same trap ensnares us when we mistake symmetry of information for symmetry of outcomes, leading investors to chase switching strategies that ultimately cost them more than staying the course, and reminding us that the paradox's deepest lesson is not about envelopes at all, but about the dangers of treating mathematical elegance as a substitute for understanding the world from which our problems actually arise. The paradox ultimately teaches us that rationality without context is merely the art of being precisely wrong, and that the most dangerous moments in decision-making arrive not when we lack information, but when we mistake the structure of our uncertainty for knowledge itself. This is precisely why the paradox has resisted resolution for centuries, not because mathematics has failed us, but because it exposes the thin line between formal logic and the messy reality of how decisions must actually be made, a boundary that becomes invisible only when we forget that every equation requires assumptions, and every assumption conceals a choice about what we choose to ignore. The envelope paradox thus stands as a monument to this hidden architecture of reasoning, a warning that whenever we find ourselves compelled by mathematical logic to reverse course infinitely, we should pause and ask not whether our calculations are correct, but whether the premises we built them upon were ever sound to begin with, for it is in the gap between what we can calculate and what we can truly know that paradox finds its eternal home. Imagine two individuals arrested for a crime and placed in separate interrogation rooms with no ability to communicate with one another, and each is presented with an identical choice that will determine both of their fates, a scenario that has become the foundation for understanding human cooperation and betrayal in mathematics, economics, and psychology. Each prisoner is told that if they both remain silent, they will each receive a light sentence of 1 year in prison. But if one prisoner confesses while the other remains silent, the confessor will be released immediately while the silent prisoner receives 3 years, and if both prisoners confess, they will each receive 2 years in prison. The logical trap is immediate and elegant in its cruelty. From the perspective of individual self-interest, each prisoner should confess, because confessing guarantees a better outcome than remaining silent regardless of what the other person does. Yet when both prisoners follow this rational logic and both confess, they both end up worse off than if they had cooperated and both remained silent. The mechanism that creates this paradox operates through the asymmetry of incentives and the isolation of decision-making, where the temptation to betray a cooperating partner is always greater than the reward for mutual cooperation. And simultaneously, the fear of being betrayed creates pressure to defect first, generating a cascade of self-interested decisions that collectively produce the worst possible outcome for everyone involved. This same structural problem appears throughout human civilization in ways we barely notice. In international relations, where nations escalate military spending because each fears the other will gain advantage. In business competition, where companies engage in destructive pricing wars that harm all competitors. In environmental policy, where individual nations and corporations extract resources unsustainably because the cost of restraint falls on them individually while the benefits of restraint are shared globally. And in countless personal relationships where mutual distrust and fear of exploitation leads people to protective behaviors that ultimately damage the relationship itself. Yet despite centuries of understanding this logical problem, and despite its pervasive appearance in real human affairs, we continue to recreate these situations and fall into the same traps repeatedly, suggesting that something deeper than logic guides human behavior. Or perhaps that the conditions we create systematically prevent the communication and trust necessary to achieve mutual cooperation, even when we intellectually understand it would benefit everyone involved. The most striking discovery from decades of experimental game theory is that humans actually do cooperate far more readily than the pure logic of the dilemma predicts, suggesting that our evolved capacity for reciprocity, reputation management, and moral intuition can override the mathematics of self-interest when the conditions allow for it. Yet we seem curiously unable to extend these same cooperative instincts to larger-scale problems where the players are abstract, numerous, or distant, as if our tribal psychology has not yet evolved the emotional and social machinery necessary to feel kinship with the global commons or the distant future. This gap between our capacity for small group cooperation and our failure at large-scale coordination may be the defining challenge of our era, visible in climate negotiations, where individual nations hesitate to sacrifice economic growth, in social media, where platforms profit from engagement algorithms that fragment shared reality, and in pandemic response, where vaccine nationalism and misinformation undermine collective survival. Revealing that the prisoner's dilemma remains not merely an abstract thought experiment, but the actual structure of modern existence. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the prisoner's dilemma is that awareness of its logic does not free us from it. Knowing the trap exists does not automatically grant us the ability to escape it, suggesting that some problems require not just intellectual understanding, but the creation of entirely new institutional structures, enforcement mechanisms, and cultural narratives that can align it. Imagine you possess an object, a stone perhaps, that has been described to you as capable of granting any wish, solving any problem, and manifesting any desire into physical reality without limitation or consequence. You hold this stone in your hands right now, and you have been told with absolute certainty that it works, that countless people before you have used it successfully, that the only requirement is your genuine belief and your willingness to ask. The stone sits there smooth and warm, waiting for your request, and yet you find yourself unable to articulate what you truly want most, or perhaps more troublingly, you begin to suspect that the stone might not work at all, and that your doubt itself is the only thing preventing it from working, creating a perfect logical trap from which there is no escape. The psychological mechanism at work here is the collision between unlimited possibility and the paralyzing weight of infinite choice, combined with the erosion of certainty through skepticism. When faced with genuinely limitless power, the human mind does not experience liberation, but rather a kind of vertigo, because every wish you could possibly make suddenly feels simultaneously too insignificant to waste on a stone of infinite power and too important to risk stating incorrectly. Furthermore, the very fact that the stone's efficacy depends on your belief means that your inability to believe perfectly becomes the reason it fails, a self-fulfilling prophecy that no amount of rational analysis can penetrate. We have normalized this paradox in our culture through countless stories, legends, and spiritual traditions that promise ultimate power conditional on faith, on acceptance, on the surrendering of rational doubt, and yet we live in an age where skepticism and evidence are valued above all else, creating an impossible tension that we carry with us silently, rarely acknowledging that we are all waiting for our own omnipotent stone, all believing and disbelieving simultaneously. All trapped in the moment between wishing and doubt. Perhaps this is why we construct smaller omnipotent stones in our daily lives: lottery tickets, self-help books, therapy, productivity apps, each one a diminished version of the original paradox, each one requiring just enough belief to purchase but not so much that we feel foolish when it inevitably disappoints, allowing us to participate in the ancient ritual of magical thinking while maintaining plausible deniability about our own desperation. And in this careful calibration of hope and skepticism, we have created a kind of psychological comfort zone where we can simultaneously pursue transformation and protect ourselves from the vulnerability of truly believing in it, which may be the only way modern consciousness can survive the unbearable weight of its own potential. We see this most clearly in the moment someone achieves a long-sought goal only to find it hollow, or worse, to immediately replace it with another desire, realizing too late that the stone was never the problem, our ability to imagine satisfaction was. And yet we continue seeking anyway, because the alternative, accepting that no stone exists and no wish will ever feel complete, is a despair so profound that hope itself becomes the only rational response. So we live in this strange modern alchemy, transforming our deepest longings into manageable, purchasable forms: a gym membership instead of transformation, a self-help book instead of enlightenment, a 5-year plan instead of destiny, each one a small negotiation with our own powerlessness, each one a way of saying to ourselves that we are still trying, still reaching, even as we know the stone will not deliver what we ask of it. And perhaps the cruelest irony is that the stone's true power lies not in granting wishes, but in revealing to us, through our inability to use it, exactly who we are beneath our desires. A confrontation so intimate that we would almost rather it remain broken, almost rather preserve the possibility of magic than face the reality of ourselves. And so we keep the stone in our pocket, never fully using it, never fully discarding it, because that ambiguous state of potential is the only magic we can actually afford to believe in. Consider the fundamental tension that has occupied theologians, philosophers, and ordinary people for millennia. If an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God exists, why does suffering persist in the world? A child is diagnosed with a terminal illness at age 5, experiencing pain that serves no developmental purpose and offers no moral lesson to the child itself. A tsunami kills 200,000 people in a single moment, devastating families and communities with no warning and no opportunity for intervention. A person dedicates their entire life to kindness and compassion, only to endure decades of psychological torment through depression and anxiety that no amount of virtue seems to alleviate. These are not abstract philosophical puzzles confined to academic discourse. They are the lived experiences of billions of people who have confronted meaningless suffering and found themselves unable to reconcile it with the existence of a benevolent deity. The logical mechanism underlying this problem operates through a simple contradiction. The coexistence of an omnipotent being who could prevent all suffering, an omniscient being who knows all suffering will occur, an infinitely good being who would want to prevent suffering, and yet the undeniable reality of suffering that serves no apparent purpose. If God is all-powerful, he can prevent evil. If he is all-knowing, he foresees evil. If he is all-good, he would want to prevent evil. And yet evil exists in abundance. Some attempt to resolve this through the free will defense, suggesting that God permits suffering because genuine freedom requires the possibility of moral choice. But this explanation falters when confronted with natural disasters, childhood diseases, and the suffering of creatures incapable of moral agency. Others propose that suffering builds character or teaches lessons, yet this framework collapses under scrutiny when one considers the vast excess of suffering relative to any conceivable educational value, and the reality that many people are destroyed rather than strengthened by their ordeals. What persists despite the logical impossibility is a kind of resigned acceptance among believers, a willingness to live with the contradiction rather than abandon faith entirely. People develop elaborate theological frameworks to justify why their God permits the suffering of innocents, constructing narratives that attempt to extract meaning from meaninglessness, purpose from purposelessness, and divine intention from what appears to be cosmic indifference. This normalization of the paradox reflects a deeper human tendency to maintain cherished beliefs even when confronted with evidence that fundamentally challenges them, choosing instead to expand and complicate our explanations rather than relinquish our convictions. Yet this cognitive flexibility, while psychologically adaptive in the short term, may prevent us from confronting uncomfortable truths about the universe's actual nature. That suffering might persist not because of divine mysteries beyond our comprehension, but because the universe operates according to indifferent physical laws, and meaning, rather than being discovered in suffering, must be constructed despite it. This reframing does not diminish human suffering or render compassion irrelevant. Rather, it locates both in a framework where alleviating pain becomes a moral imperative precisely because no cosmic force will do so on our behalf, and where the search for meaning in tragedy becomes an act of human creativity rather than divine discovery. In this light, the person who sits with a dying loved one and holds their hand, not because God ordained this suffering for some hidden purpose, but because love demands presence in the face of meaninglessness, may be engaging in the most authentically moral act available to conscious beings in an indifferent universe. This shift in perspective transforms suffering from a theological problem requiring divine justification into a human challenge demanding our collective response, suggesting that the deepest evil may not be the suffering itself, but our failure to reduce it when we possess the knowledge and resources to do so. Consider the moment you taste chocolate, the particular richness and bitterness that floods across your tongue, the way it dissolves on your palate with a sensation entirely unique to that experience and no other. Now consider that a neuroscientist could map every single neural firing pattern in your brain during that exact moment, could identify every chemical reaction occurring in your taste receptors, could document the precise electrical impulses traveling through your sensory cortex, and yet would still face an insurmountable gap between all of that objective data and the subjective reality of what chocolate actually tastes like from the inside of your consciousness. This is the hard problem of consciousness, the question that philosophers and scientists have grappled with for decades without resolution, the inquiry into why physical processes in the brain somehow give rise to the felt quality of experience itself. You could theoretically build a machine that responds to chocolate in every measurable way that you do, that mimics your behavior perfectly, that claims to taste chocolate, and yet we have no way of knowing whether there is actually something it is like to be that machine, whether there is subjective experience occurring within its processes or merely the simulation of it. The mechanism underlying this persistent puzzle seems rooted in a fundamental category error in how we approach consciousness as a problem at all, as if subjective experience were something that could be reduced to objective facts through sufficient observation and analysis, when the very nature of subjectivity appears to be irreducible to third-person description. We have become so accustomed to solving every other mystery through scientific methodology that we have normalized the assumption that consciousness too must eventually yield to the same approach, that with enough neuroimaging technology and enough time, the qualitative nature of experience will somehow resolve into quantities, that the explanatory gap will close, and yet decades of unprecedented advances in neuroscience have somehow only sharpened the gap rather than narrowed it. The persistence of this problem suggests something deeper about the limits of a materialist framework itself, about whether consciousness was ever the kind of thing that objective investigation could in principle address, and we continue forward asking the same unanswerable questions as though repetition and refinement of our tools might eventually produce the answer that our current framework cannot provide. Perhaps the hard problem persists not because we lack the right technology, but because we are asking consciousness to explain itself in a language it was never meant to speak, the language of objects and mechanisms rather than subjects and experience. And in demanding that subjective phenomena conform to objective categories, we have already predetermined that no answer we receive could ever feel like a genuine solution. This is not to say that consciousness is somehow mystical or beyond understanding, but rather that understanding itself may require a fundamental shift in epistemology, a willingness to acknowledge that some domains of knowledge might be accessible only from the inside, that first-person authority over subjective experience represents a kind of evidence that third-person science, by its very nature, cannot capture or validate. The color red as you perceive it, the ache of loneliness, the taste of your mother's cooking, these are not problems awaiting solutions but irreducible facts of being that science can describe around but never penetrate, and perhaps that boundary itself is not a failure of our current methods, but a feature of reality revealing something essential about the structure of knowledge and existence. To accept this is to recognize that consciousness may not be a problem to be solved so much as a mystery to be inhabited, a domain where the observer and the observed remain forever intertwined, and where the deepest truths about experience might only become visible when we stop trying to convert them into something else entirely. Consider a simple scenario that has puzzled philosophers for thousands of years. You are standing in front of a large pile of sand on a beach, and someone asks you to remove one grain at a time until nothing remains. The question they pose is deceptively straightforward. At what exact point does the pile of sand cease to be a pile? If you remove one grain, you still have a pile. Remove another grain, and you still have a pile. Remove another and another and another, continuing this process indefinitely, and at some moment you will be left with a single grain of sand, which nobody would reasonably call a pile. Yet there is no precise moment, no exact grain whose removal transforms the pile into a non-pile, because the removal of one single grain can never change something from being a pile to not being a pile. This is the Sorites Paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, and it reveals something profound about the limitations of language and human categorization when applied to continuous or gradual phenomena. The paradox emerges from a peculiar tension between two equally reasonable observations. First, that one grain of sand makes no difference to whether something is a pile, and second, that eventually, through repeated removals, we end up with something that is clearly not a pile. The logical mechanism that creates this impossibility is rooted in how our language attempts to apply discrete categories to inherently continuous or vague phenomena. We use the word pile as though it has a crisp boundary, a sharp threshold that divides things that are piles from things that are not piles, yet reality does not cooperate with this linguistic demand. The same paradox applies to countless situations in human life. At what point does someone become bald as they lose hair one strand at a time? At what exact moment does a child become an adult? At what precise temperature does water stop being cold and become warm? At what number of grains of rice does a collection become a heap? Each of these involves the same fundamental problem of applying rigid categories to inherently fuzzy domains. What makes this paradox psychologically persistent despite its apparent simplicity is that we navigate these fuzzy boundaries constantly without any problem in everyday life. which suggests our minds have learned to tolerate this ambiguity even though our formal logic cannot explain it. We live comfortably with the contradiction because practical life does not require absolute precision about pilehood or baldness or adulthood. We use context, convention, and reasonable judgment to make these distinctions work, and we rarely encounter situations where the vagueness truly matters. Yet when we attempt to formalize our reasoning and demand that the paradox yield to pure logic, we find ourselves trapped, unable to produce the precise boundary we intuitively sense exists somewhere. This paradox persists in human thought because it highlights a fundamental gap between how language works and how the world actually is, and we have largely learned to accept this gap as an inevitable feature of communication rather than a flaw to be corrected. Yet perhaps this acceptance itself is the paradox's deepest lesson, that human cognition thrives not by imposing false precision on an ambiguous world, but by developing sophisticated systems of judgment that navigate vagueness with flexibility and wisdom, suggesting that the real problem may not be with our language or our minds, but with our insistence that reality must conform to the binary categories of formal logic. The Sorites Paradox thus invites us to reconsider not whether our categories are imperfect, but whether perfection itself is the wrong standard, whether the goal should instead be to develop ever more nuanced frameworks for understanding gradual change, frameworks that acknowledge degrees and transitions rather than demanding the impossible clarity of sharp dividing lines that nature itself refuses to provide. In this way, the Sorites Paradox becomes not merely a logical puzzle to be solved, but an invitation to humility, a recognition that the most important categories in human life, from justice to beauty to love, are themselves irreducibly vague, and that this vagueness is not a defect but perhaps a feature that allows these concepts to. Imagine a judge who tells a condemned prisoner on a Friday that they will be executed sometime during the following week, but the execution will be a surprise. The prisoner will not know which day it will occur until the morning it happens. The prisoner, sitting in their cell, begins to reason through the problem with relentless logic. They think to themselves that the execution cannot possibly occur on Friday, the last day of the week, because if they had not been executed by Thursday evening, they would know with certainty that Friday was the day, and therefore it would not be a surprise. So Friday is eliminated. But now that Friday is impossible, Thursday becomes the new last possible day, and by the same logic, if they survive until Thursday morning, they would know Thursday is the day, which would eliminate the surprise, so Thursday too must be impossible. This same reasoning applies to Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday, working backward through each day of the week, until the prisoner concludes that no day can possibly result in a surprising execution, and therefore the judge's statement is logically incoherent. Yet when the execution does occur on, say, Wednesday morning, the prisoner is genuinely shocked and surprised, despite having reasoned that surprise was impossible. The paradox persists because the prisoner's logical reasoning seems airtight, yet reality stubbornly refuses to conform to it. The mechanism at work here involves a peculiar breakdown in self-reference and the limits of deductive certainty. The prisoner's reasoning is formally valid, yet something about applying it to a real-world scenario involving their own knowledge and expectations creates a strange loop where the logical elimination of possibilities somehow fails to eliminate the actual event. Philosophers and logicians have grappled with this paradox for decades without reaching consensus, proposing solutions ranging from claiming the judge's statement is simply contradictory and therefore void, to suggesting that the prisoner's reasoning itself contains a hidden flaw that only becomes apparent when examined from a certain angle. What makes this paradox so peculiarly persistent is that it reveals something unsettling about the nature of surprise, knowledge, and prediction, that our logical certainties sometimes crumble when confronted with the recursive problem of knowing what we cannot know, and that the very act of reasoning about our own ignorance can paradoxically create that ignorance anew. In this sense, the paradox mirrors other self-referential puzzles like the liar's paradox. This statement is false, where the attempt to evaluate the truth of a claim undermines the very framework needed to evaluate it. The unexpected hanging reminds us that some of our deepest logical systems may contain irreducible tensions when they turn their gaze inward upon themselves. Perhaps this is why the paradox has proven so resistant to resolution. It does not merely expose a flaw in reasoning, but rather illuminates a fundamental gap between the logical structure of knowledge and the lived experience of uncertainty, a gap that may be unbridgeable precisely because our attempts to reason our way across it only deepen the chasm we are trying to cross. In this way, the unexpected hanging paradox serves as a cautionary tale about the hubris of pure reason, a reminder that even our most rigorous logical systems are ultimately embedded in a world of contingency, surprise, and radical uncertainty that they can never fully master or predict from within. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson, that the prisoner's error lies not in faulty logic, but in assuming that perfect knowledge of the logical situation would prevent surprise, when in fact the very structure of self-awareness, the mind examining its own ignorance, inevitably generates blind spots that no amount of reasoning can illuminate from within. The prisoner's reasoning fails not because logic is broken, but because the act of reasoning about one's own future creates new information that changes the very situation being reasoned about, a recursive loop where self-knowledge becomes self-defeating. Consider the moment when a single atom splits into two smaller atoms, releasing enormous quantities of energy in the process, a phenomenon we have harnessed to power cities and to create weapons of unimaginable destructive capacity, yet we remain fundamentally uncertain about whether this process is truly irreversible or whether the energy released could theoretically be reversed back into the original unified state through some mechanism we have not yet discovered. Creating a paradox wherein we base entire civilizations on a physical process, we simultaneously accept and question at the most fundamental level. The fission problem emerges from the observation that while we can describe with mathematical precision how atoms split and how energy converts from mass into radiation according to Einstein's equations, we cannot adequately explain why this process moves only in one direction through time, why we never observe the reverse occurring spontaneously, and whether the arrow of time itself is truly embedded in the physics of nuclear reactions or merely in our perception of probability and entropy. When we examine the psychological dimension of this uncertainty, we discover that humans have built an entire technological and geopolitical infrastructure upon a foundation that contains this unresolved question at its core. Yet we rarely acknowledge that our deepest understanding of nuclear energy rests on accepting certain asymmetries that we cannot fully justify through first principles. We have normalized this contradiction by compartmentalizing our knowledge, teaching the engineering of fission in one context while discussing fundamental physics in another, never quite bridging the gap between how we use these processes and what we truly understand about their nature. The fission problem persists because it challenges our assumption that technologies we depend upon must rest on complete understanding, revealing instead that we often build the most consequential systems on foundations of acceptable uncertainty, on mathematical models that predict outcomes without explaining underlying mechanisms, and on the implicit agreement that some questions need not be answered as long as the practical applications continue to function reliably and consistently within observable parameters. Yet this acceptance of uncertainty becomes more precarious when we consider that the same fission process we have normalized as reliable energy production is fundamentally identical to the uncontrolled chain reactions that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki, suggesting that our compartmentalization of knowledge may itself be a necessary psychological mechanism for tolerating the proximity of creation and annihilation within the same physical phenomenon. The fission problem thus reveals that our relationship with technology is not one of mastery, but of managed coexistence with forces we have learned to channel without fully comprehending, and that the stability of our civilization depends less on having solved the deepest questions of physics than on maintaining the psychological structures that allow us to live productively alongside our own uncertainties. This psychological compartmentalization extends beyond nuclear physics into virtually every domain where we have outsourced our survival to systems we do not fully understand, from the algorithms that manage our financial markets to the microbial ecosystems within our own bodies, suggesting that the fission problem is not an anomaly, but rather the defining condition of modern consciousness. Where the price of technological advancement has been a kind of strategic amnesia about the limits of our knowledge. And perhaps this strategic amnesia is not a flaw but an evolutionary adaptation, a necessary narrowing of attention that allows us to function in a world of overwhelming complexity. Yet it also means we remain perpetually vulnerable to the consequences of knowledge we have chosen not to integrate, consequences that arrive without warning when the systems we have learned to trust suddenly fail or reveal dimensions we had successfully forgotten existed. Imagine a donkey standing precisely equidistant between two identical piles of hay, each one equally appealing, equally nourishing, and equally distant from where the animal stands in perfect equilibrium between them. The donkey experiences no reason to choose one pile over the other because there exists no rational basis for preferring left over right or right over left. And so the animal, governed entirely by reason and logic, finds itself unable to move in either direction and consequently starves to death in the space between two sources of sustenance. This is the paradox that medieval philosopher Jean Buridan explored when considering the nature of choice, free will, and rational decision-making. A thought experiment that reveals something peculiar about how reason itself functions when confronted with genuinely equal alternatives that demand a decision despite offering no logical differentiation. The mechanism at work here involves a fundamental assumption about rational choice, which is that every action must be preceded by a reason that justifies that action over its alternatives. Yet when those alternatives are truly identical in every meaningful way, reason cannot provide such justification. And if an agent refuses to act without rational justification, paralysis becomes inevitable. We encounter versions of this dilemma constantly throughout human existence, in choices between nearly identical products, between job offers with equivalent compensation, between romantic partners with matching qualities, or even in the mundane selection of which direction to walk when both paths lead to the same destination. And yet human beings do not generally starve between piles of hay, as the thought experiment suggests they would. Instead, we make arbitrary choices, we flip imaginary coins, we select based on the slightest preference that might not even reach conscious awareness, we act on impulse or custom or mood, and in doing so we acknowledge that pure reason cannot be the only mechanism governing human action. The paradox persists in philosophy and in our collective imagination precisely because it exposes the inadequacy of pure rationalism as a complete model of decision-making. Yet we continue to privilege rational justification in how we discuss and evaluate our choices, as though we ought to be able to provide logical reasons for everything we do. Perhaps the true wisdom lies not in resolving the paradox, but in accepting that rationality itself requires this irrational supplement. That choice demands not just reasons, but the willingness to act despite the absence of complete justification, a capacity that distinguishes living agents from the frozen logic of pure mathematics. The donkey, in this sense, becomes a mirror held up to our own pretensions of rationality, a reminder that the ability to act in the face of uncertainty, to choose without guarantee, and to move forward despite the absence of perfect justification is not a failure of reason, but perhaps its truest and most necessary expression. And so when we find ourselves paralyzed between equally viable options, unable to commit to a career path, a relationship, a creative direction, we might recognize in that paralysis not a logical problem awaiting rational solution, but an invitation to acknowledge the creative, generative force of arbitrary choice itself, the way that picking and committing, even without perfect justification, is what transforms possibility into reality and allows us to become the authors of our own lives rather than remaining forever suspended in the space of pure potential. The medieval logicians who first debated Buridan's paradox could not have anticipated how thoroughly modern life would multiply such moments of equipoise, how we would construct entire economies around the paralysis of choice, offering us decision frameworks and algorithms and expert recommendations precisely because we have lost faith in our capacity to act without exhaustive rational justification. Yet perhaps what we require is not more information, but rather permission to embrace the leap beyond it. The donkey, after all, never needed permission. It simply chose, and in that choice, however arbitrary, it became something more than a perfectly rational machine frozen by its own logic. Imagine a billionaire presents you with a clear bottle containing an unknown liquid and offers you $1 million on a single condition. You must intend to drink the toxin tomorrow, but you will not actually drink it, and if you succeed in forming this intention without drinking it, the money is yours by morning. The toxin itself is real and would make you painfully ill for several hours if consumed, but it causes no permanent damage and no lasting harm, yet the challenge seems impossibly paradoxical, because as soon as you form the genuine intention to drink the poison tomorrow, you immediately recognize that you could simply choose not to drink it when tomorrow arrives, which means your intention was never truly genuine in the first place. This is Kavka's Toxin puzzle, a thought experiment that has troubled philosophers and logicians for decades, because it reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of intention, commitment, and the rational mind. The puzzle creates what appears to be a logical impossibility, because intention and action seem permanently linked in human psychology. Yet the game explicitly requires them to be separated, demanding that you genuinely intend to do something self-destructive while simultaneously knowing you will not follow through, which feels like asking someone to believe something they know to be false while simultaneously knowing they are pretending. The mechanism that makes this puzzle so philosophically vexing is that it exposes the difference between what we might call transparent intentions and opaque intentions, where a transparent intention is one whose content you can see clearly and adjust accordingly, while an opaque intention would require you to somehow hide the truth of the situation from yourself, to create a kind of motivated irrationality where you convince yourself you really will drink the poison despite all evidence suggesting you will not. Some philosophers have suggested that perhaps you could use various psychological tricks to achieve this state, such as making a public commitment to drink the toxin, or arranging for someone to monitor you, or using hypnotic suggestion to create a false belief. Yet each of these workarounds seems to undermine the purity of the original challenge by introducing external coercion or self-deception rather than genuine rational intention. The puzzle persists in philosophical discourse despite having no satisfying solution, because it illuminates the strange gap between our rational understanding and our psychological capacity for commitment, revealing that we are not entirely rational agents who can simply choose our intentions as we might choose our clothes, but rather creatures whose intentions are bound up with our beliefs, desires, and the causal structure of our own minds in ways that sometimes create genuine logical tangles. We have essentially normalized this impossibility by accepting it as a permanent feature of human rationality rather than seeing it as a flaw in our understanding, acknowledging quietly that there are certain mental states we simply cannot voluntarily create or maintain without the support of genuine circumstances, and that the very attempt to engineer them tends to collapse under the weight of self-awareness and transparent reasoning. Yet perhaps this is precisely what makes Kavka's puzzle so valuable. Rather than revealing a flaw in human rationality, it reveals the wisdom embedded in our inability to fully compartmentalize intention from belief, showing us that our minds have evolved safeguards against the kind of self-deception that would leave us genuinely vulnerable to harm. In this light, Kavka's puzzle stops being a mere logical curiosity and becomes instead a mirror held up to the architecture of human motivation itself, showing us that rationality without the possibility of self-deception may be not a strength but a kind of cognitive vulnerability, a system too transparent to protect itself from its own reasoning. This realization suggests that the puzzle's apparent impossibility may not be a bug in human cognition, but rather a feature, a kind of psychological integrity that prevents us from becoming creatures capable of wholesale self-deception, which might paradoxically make us more trustworthy both to ourselves and to others. Imagine you are looking at your watch on a Tuesday afternoon and it reads 3 o'clock, so you form the belief that it is 3 o'clock. You would say you know it is 3 o'clock because you have looked at a reliable instrument and formed a justified true belief about the time. However, unbeknownst to you, your watch stopped working at 3 o'clock exactly 1 week ago, and by pure coincidence, the actual current time happens to be 3 o'clock right now. In this scenario, your belief is true. It is indeed 3 o'clock, and your belief seems justified because you looked at what appeared to be a reliable source, yet we hesitate to say you actually know what time it is. This puzzle, first articulated by philosopher Edmund Gettier in 1963, reveals a peculiar gap in our understanding of what knowledge actually is. For centuries, philosophers had defined knowledge as justified true belief, a definition that seemed to capture something fundamental about how we understand the world. A belief must be true, meaning it corresponds to reality. A belief must be justified, meaning you have good reasons for holding it, and obviously you must actually hold the belief. These three conditions seemed sufficient, yet Gettier demonstrated through clever scenarios that these conditions alone do not guarantee knowledge. The mechanism at work in such cases involves a separation between your justification and the actual truth. Your justification points toward one explanation for why your belief is true, but the actual reason your belief happens to be true is entirely different, something hidden from your reasoning. You think the watch works, so you trust it, so your belief is justified. The watch does not work, but the time happens to be correct anyway, so your belief is true. Yet the connection between your justification and the truth seems broken, fractured by coincidence. What makes Gettier cases so philosophically perplexing is that they expose a kind of epistemic luck, a situation where you get the truth through accident rather than through reliable cognitive access to reality. This problem persists despite decades of philosophical effort to solve it, with hundreds of proposed definitions of knowledge offered as alternatives, each attempting to add some additional condition that would eliminate Gettier cases. Some philosophers have suggested that knowledge requires a causal connection between your belief and the fact that makes it true. Others have proposed that you must not base your belief on false lemmas or intermediate beliefs that are themselves false. Still others argue that your belief-forming process must be appropriately reliable or sensitive to the actual facts. Yet each proposed solution generates its own counterexamples, its own unusual scenarios where the proposed additional condition is satisfied, but we still feel hesitant to call it knowledge. What persists is our intuitive sense that something is missing when fortune rather than reason connects our minds to reality, yet we struggle to articulate precisely what that missing element should be. Perhaps this is why the Gettier problem remains so resistant to resolution. It may not be asking for a better definition of knowledge at all, but rather revealing something deeper about the nature of understanding itself, something that resists neat logical formulation. The problem invites us to recognize that knowledge might be less about satisfying a checklist of conditions and more about achieving a genuine cognitive relationship with the world, one where luck plays no role in connecting what we believe to what is true. This shift in perspective suggests that knowledge might ultimately depend on the quality of our epistemic relationship with reality, not merely whether our beliefs happen to align with facts, but whether we have earned that alignment through processes genuinely attuned to truth rather than through fortunate accident. In this light, the Gettier problem transforms from a mere logical puzzle into a profound question about human cognition. Whether knowledge is fundamentally about the reliability of our methods for accessing truth, or whether it requires something more elusive, a kind of epistemic integrity where our understanding genuinely tracks reality rather than merely stumbling upon it. Consider the moment you decide to raise your hand in a meeting, or choose what to eat for breakfast, or decide to turn left instead of right on your morning walk. In each of these instances, you experience a profound sense of agency, a felt certainty that you are the author of your own choices, that your consciousness is steering the ship of your behavior through deliberate decision-making. You feel the weight of consideration, you sense the moment of choice crystallizing in your mind, and then you act according to that choice. This sensation is so immediate, so visceral, so utterly convincing that it feels absurd to question whether it is real. Yet neuroscience has revealed something rather unsettling about this experience. Brain imaging studies consistently show that neural activity associated with a decision begins in the brain several seconds before you become consciously aware of having made that decision. Electrical signals fire in your prefrontal cortex, patterns cascade through your neural networks, and only after this process has already begun do you experience the subjective sensation of choosing. What this suggests is that your conscious experience of deciding may be something more like a post hoc narration, a story your brain tells you about decisions that were already in motion before your awareness arrived on the scene. The mechanism underlying this puzzle appears to involve the complex relationship between conscious and unconscious processes in the brain. Your brain is constantly processing information, running countless calculations, weighing options, and integrating stimuli from your environment, all of this occurring beneath the threshold of your conscious awareness. When sufficient neural momentum has accumulated behind a particular course of action, your conscious mind becomes aware of this momentum and retrospectively attributes it to a moment of deliberate choice. In essence, your consciousness may be experiencing the outcome of a process rather than directing the process itself. Yet despite this mounting evidence, despite decades of philosophical argument and scientific investigation, most people continue to live as though free will is unquestionably real and complete. You make plans based on the assumption that you will freely choose to follow through on them. You hold others morally responsible for their choices because you fundamentally believe they could have done otherwise. You experience guilt and pride, regret and satisfaction, all emotions that seem to presuppose genuine freedom and genuine authorship of your actions. This persistent belief in free will, even in the face of scientific uncertainty, remains remarkably resilient. Perhaps this is because abandoning the intuitive sense of free will feels psychologically impossible, or perhaps because the alternative, a world of pure determinism or randomness, seems to drain meaning from human existence. Or perhaps free will and determinism are not truly incompatible concepts, and the question itself rests on assumptions we have not yet examined carefully enough. Whatever the case may be, here you rest in the darkness, contemplating whether the very act of contemplating this question is something you freely chose to do, or merely something your brain has already decided you would do while your consciousness catches up, narrating along behind. And in that uncertainty lies perhaps the deepest irony. The question of free will may itself be unanswerable not because the answer is hidden from us, but because the very apparatus we use to seek the answer, your conscious mind, your reasoning, your sense of self, may be the product of the very processes we are trying to understand. Yet perhaps this is precisely where the investigation must begin, not by trying to step outside the machinery of your own mind, but by accepting that you are both the observer and the observed, both the question and the questioner, and that this strange recursion is not a flaw in the inquiry, but its most essential feature. In this light, the free will question becomes less about discovering some hidden truth and more about understanding what it means to be a conscious being caught between the illusion of control and the reality of causal processes, a being who must act as though free, even while acknowledging the profound un. Consider the question of what makes you who you are, and you will find yourself standing at the threshold of one of humanity's most enduring and fundamentally irresolvable inquiries. We observe that identical twins separated at birth and raised in completely different environments often develop strikingly similar personalities, preferences, and behavioral patterns, suggesting that our genetic inheritance exerts a powerful and perhaps overwhelming influence on our fundamental nature. Yet simultaneously, we witness countless examples of individuals who emerge from nearly identical genetic backgrounds and shared family environments to become radically different people, with entirely divergent values, ambitions, and psychological profiles, which would seem to prove that nurture, environment, experience, and circumstance shape us more completely than any strand of DNA ever could. The tension between these two observations has persisted for centuries, spawning countless research studies, longitudinal investigations, and scientific analyses, and yet no amount of empirical evidence has ever resolved the question decisively in either direction. We continue to discover new mechanisms through which genetics influence behavior, discovering epigenetic processes and gene expression patterns that suggest nature operates far more subtly and contextually than we previously understood, while simultaneously uncovering new ways that early childhood experiences, cultural conditioning, traumatic events, and social environments literally reshape the physical structure of the developing brain, rewiring neural pathways and altering the very foundations of personality and perception. The reason this question persists despite our scientific sophistication is that it represents not merely an empirical puzzle, but a fundamental conceptual confusion about the nature of causation itself. When we ask whether nature or nurture determines who we become, we are implicitly treating these as separate forces operating independently, when in reality they constitute a thoroughly entangled system in which genes require environmental triggers to express themselves, while environments can only affect us through our genetic material and neurobiological architecture. We have normalized the persistence of this question by treating it as though it should have a definitive answer, as though one factor must ultimately prove more important than the other, when the actual evidence suggests something far more unsettling. That the question itself is malformed, that it asks us to separate two things that cannot meaningfully be separated, and that our continued inability to resolve it reflects not a limitation in our science, but a limitation in our language and conceptual frameworks. Perhaps this is why the question endures most powerfully not in laboratories, but in the private moments when we wonder whether we have inherited our parents' worst traits or escaped them through sheer force of will, moments in which the abstract debate becomes urgently personal and the distinction between nature and nurture collapses into the singular mystery of how we came to be ourselves. In those moments of honest self-examination, we recognize that the question was never really about genetics or environment at all, but about agency and accountability, about whether we are the authors of our own becoming or merely the products of forces beyond our control. And perhaps the deepest truth is that we need both the scientific understanding that we are shaped by inheritance and circumstance, and the existential conviction that we possess some capacity to transcend them. For without the former, we cannot act with compassion toward ourselves and others, and without the latter, we surrender the very possibility of meaningful choice. This paradox that we must simultaneously believe ourselves both determined and free is not a logical contradiction to be resolved, but a lived reality to be inhabited, and it is precisely in this uncomfortable middle ground that genuine wisdom about human nature actually resides. The parent who recognizes their own destructive patterns in their child's behavior and chooses differently anyway. The individual who transcends a traumatic childhood through deliberate self-examination. The community that rewrites its cult. Imagine yourself behind a veil of complete ignorance about who you will become in the world, stripped of knowledge about your race, gender, class, abilities, talents, and social position, forced to design the rules of society knowing you could emerge as anyone within it. And this thought experiment asks you a question that seems impossibly simple, yet remains genuinely unanswerable. What kind of society would you create if you had to live in it, but couldn't know which role you'd occupy? The original position, as conceived by philosopher John Rawls, removes the information that typically allows us to bias social structures in our own favor, creating a hypothetical condition where rational self-interest and ignorance align in peculiar ways. Yet we struggle to answer what this actually produces, because we cannot actually inhabit such a state of pure uncertainty, because our minds are fundamentally shaped by the knowledge of who we already are. And because the moment we try to imagine ourselves behind the veil, we begin smuggling in our current perspectives and privileges without quite realizing it. The mechanism underlying this persistent puzzle operates through what we might call the paradox of perspectival elimination, where removing perspective doesn't create neutrality, but rather creates an impossible void that our minds reflexively fill with unstated assumptions, so that when we attempt to choose principles of justice from behind this veil of ignorance, we discover that our reasoning has already been colonized by the very biases we were supposed to transcend. And we cannot step outside our own cognitive frameworks even when we're explicitly told to do so, even when the entire point of the exercise is to achieve that transcendence. The question persists in philosophical circles and in popular discussions about fairness, equality, and social contracts, despite this fundamental impossibility, because there remains something psychologically compelling about the attempt itself. Something that seems like it should work in theory, something that appeals to our desire for impartiality and our sense that justice requires the removal of arbitrary advantage. Yet we maintain this impossible ideal as if we can actually achieve it. As if thinking hard enough about it will somehow allow us to slip the bonds of our own situatedness, and we return to the original position again and again like a meditation or a repeated ritual that never quite delivers the clarity we expect, but which we cannot quite abandon either. Perhaps the original position's real power lies not in delivering a final answer about justice, but in forcing us to confront the specific ways we're willing to rationalize inequality, in making visible the particular arguments we reach for when asked to defend our social arrangements to someone who might inhabit any position within them, and in that moment of resistance to the thought experiment, in our inability to truly imagine ourselves as the other. We glimpse something true about the limits of our moral imagination. When we flinch from imagining ourselves as the homeless person, the imprisoned person, the person denied medical care, we reveal not just the limits of empathy but the actual contours of our moral commitments. And in that flinching lies the uncomfortable possibility that we might not want a truly just society as much as we want a society where we personally fare well, which is perhaps why Rawls's veil of ignorance remains so persistently useful even in failure. It forces us to name what we're actually choosing when we choose inequality. And when we examine those choices closely, when we notice that we're comfortable with vast wealth disparities, inadequate public education, or health care rationed by income, we're forced to ask whether we're truly reasoning from behind that veil or whether we've simply found sophisticated language to justify the advantages we already possess, which suggests that the original position's deepest insight may be not about what justice requires, but about the disturbing gap between what we claim to believe about fairness and what we're actually willing to accept. Consider the person who finds themselves trapped in a peculiar behavioral cycle where they repeatedly engage in activities, pursuits, or thought patterns that they consciously recognize as causing them distress, yet they continue anyway with full awareness of the consequences. This might manifest as scrolling through social media feeds that consistently trigger anxiety and inadequacy, knowing each swipe will likely reinforce negative self-comparisons, or the individual who actively seeks out news and information that fills them with dread about the future, despite understanding that this consumption offers no practical benefit to their actual circumstances. The phenomenon extends further into romantic relationships, where people remain connected to situations that cause them emotional pain, intellectually aware that departure would alleviate suffering yet feeling compelled to stay and continue the exposure. There exists the student who studies material in ways they know are ineffective, repeating failed methods instead of changing approach. The worker who dwells obsessively on workplace slights and rejections rather than redirecting their mental energy. The person who revisits past failures and embarrassments in their mind, knowing full well that rumination serves no constructive purpose whatsoever. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox involves a complex interplay between several human tendencies, including the familiar comfort of suffering that has become normalized, the strange compulsion to process pain repeatedly as though adequate processing will somehow retroactively prevent it, the unconscious belief that continued punishment might atone for perceived failures, and the deeply embedded habit loops that persist simply because they exist and require genuine effort to interrupt. Furthermore, the brain's tendency toward prediction and threat detection means that engaging with the source of distress creates an illusion of control and preparation, a false sense that by repeatedly exposing oneself to the discomfort, one becomes inoculated against it or gains some mysterious protective advantage. What makes this paradox particularly persistent is that it operates without requiring any logical justification, because the sufferer often lacks full conscious awareness of their participation in the cycle. Or when they do possess awareness, they assign themselves moral blame and punishment as though intentional suffering demonstrates character and commitment. The normalization of this behavior throughout human psychology and culture means that mild forms of self-torture are rarely questioned or examined, easily dismissed as simple worry or healthy caution rather than recognized as the paradoxical loop they truly are. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect is that breaking free from self-torture requires acknowledging that the suffering served no necessary purpose, a realization that demands we confront not just the pain itself, but the possibility that we inflicted it upon ourselves unnecessarily, which paradoxically feels more unbearable than continuing the familiar cycle. This is why the self-torturer often prefers the certainty of chosen suffering to the uncertainty of change. At least the devil they know demands nothing of them except continued compliance, whereas freedom requires the terrifying work of rebuilding identity around something other than the familiar wound. And so the self-torturer remains suspended in a strange stasis, neither fully committing to the pain nor taking the decisive action that would end it, finding in this liminal space a perverse kind of stability, one that costs everything yet demands nothing new, preserving at least the illusion of understanding oneself, even as that understanding becomes the very chains that bind. The cruel irony is that self-awareness itself becomes another tool of the torture. We gain just enough insight to recognize the pattern, yet not enough momentum to escape it, leaving us suspended between the pain of ignorance and the pain of knowing better, perpetually disappointed in ourselves for understanding precisely what we're doing wrong while continuing to do it anyway. Imagine you are tasked with evaluating the quality of life across different possible worlds, each containing populations of varying sizes and happiness levels, and you must decide which world is better than the others based on rational principles of ethics and well-being. In World A, 1 million people exist, and each experiences a life of profound happiness and flourishing, with rich relationships, meaningful work, and genuine contentment throughout their existence. In World B, that same 1 million people exist with identical levels of happiness and well-being, but now an additional 5 million people have been added to this world. And while these 5 million people experience lives worth living with positive experiences that outweigh negative ones, their happiness is substantially lower than that of the original million, perhaps only moderately pleasant or mildly satisfying. The mere addition paradox emerges when we recognize that most ethical frameworks struggle to determine whether World B is genuinely better than World A, despite containing more total happiness and more people living positive existences. The mechanism behind this puzzle operates on a fundamental tension in how we value moral outcomes. We can increase total happiness by adding new people into existence with positive but lower quality lives, yet doing so dilutes the average well-being of the population as a whole, creating an intuitive discomfort that seems to contradict the idea that more happiness is always preferable to less happiness. This paradox reveals that our moral intuitions contain conflicting commitments, as we simultaneously believe that increasing total well-being matters enormously, while also feeling that maintaining or improving average happiness is equally important. And when these two values clash, as they do in mere addition scenarios, we find ourselves unable to construct a coherent ethical system that satisfies all our deepest moral convictions simultaneously. We continue to grapple with this problem because it cuts at something fundamental about how we construct meaning in existence, touching on questions about whether bringing more conscious beings into the world represents an unqualified good, whether we have obligations to potential people, and how we should weigh individual well-being against aggregate well-being in our moral calculations, yet despite decades of philosophical analysis and countless proposed solutions. Each resolution seems to require abandoning some intuition that feels non-negotiable, leaving us in a state of perpetual philosophical tension. Perhaps the deepest insight this paradox offers is that it forces us to confront whether ethics itself demands an impossible perfection, a complete theoretical framework that can simultaneously honor our commitment to reducing suffering, maximizing flourishing, and respecting the inherent worth of individual lives, suggesting that some philosophical problems may not yield solutions, but rather teach us humility about the limits of rational moral systems. In this light, the mere addition paradox becomes not merely a logical puzzle to be solved, but a mirror reflecting the inherent complexity of moral reality itself, where our competing values, the desire to reduce suffering, to maximize well-being, and to respect individual dignity, may ultimately resist perfect reconciliation within any single coherent framework, inviting us instead to develop moral wisdom that acknowledges genuine tragic choices rather than seeking an impossible unified theory. This recognition might lead us toward a more mature ethical practice, one that acknowledges hard trade-offs explicitly rather than pretending they don't exist, accepting that decisions about population ethics, resource allocation, and human flourishing sometimes require us to make choices where something genuinely valuable must be sacrificed, and where intellectual humility becomes not a weakness but the truest form of moral seriousness. In practical terms, this means that a society genuinely committed to moral seriousness might need to resist the urge to construct rigid population policies or utilitarian formulas, instead cultivating institutions and practices that hold multiple values in creative tension, protecting both individual flourishing and collective well-being. Consider a woman who discovers through genetic testing that the man who raised her as her father is not biologically related to her, that she is the product of an affair or a clinic mix-up decades ago, and now she faces a peculiar philosophical vertigo that has nothing to do with betrayal or abandonment, but rather with the most unsettling question. If this biological man had never met her mother, she would not exist at all, and yet she exists now. And so how can she possibly claim that this man has wronged her by not being her biological father when his absence from her mother's life would have meant her own non-existence? Meaning that the very harm she believes she has suffered is logically dependent on the person who caused it, creating an impossible paradox where gratitude and resentment collapse into one another. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our intuitive sense of identity as something fixed and independent, something that exists in a realm prior to the circumstances that brought it about. But when we examine it closely, we discover that our identity is not separable from the specific chain of events that produced us, that the particular union of particular people at particular moments is not merely the mechanism through which we arrive, but is constitutive of who we are. Such that changing any detail in that chain, any decision made or not made, any person present or absent, would result in a different person entirely coming into existence rather than us being harmed or helped. We have somehow built entire systems of morality, law, and emotional response on the assumption that identity is prior to causation, that we are entities that can be evaluated as better or worse off depending on how we were treated. But this assumption breaks down in these edge cases where the very person who would have wronged us is the only reason we exist at all, and yet we continue to treat these scenarios as though they make sense, as though people can owe us things for genetic conditions we never chose, or as though we can hold someone responsible for decisions that were necessary conditions for our own consciousness and existence. Perhaps the deepest discomfort lies in recognizing that this logic applies not only to the circumstances of our birth, but to nearly every significant relationship and opportunity in our lives, that the person we love might owe their existence to a chance encounter we had nothing to do with, that our own children could not exist if we had made even slightly different choices. And that this web of necessary contingency extends backward and forward through time in ways that render the concept of individual desert or moral complaint almost meaningless. Yet perhaps this is not a cause for nihilism, but rather for a kind of metaphysical humility. The recognition that existence itself is a gift that precedes and supersedes complaint, that we are fundamentally creatures of contingency rather than entitlement, and that the proper response to this vertigo might be not to demand that reality conform to our moral intuitions, but to let those intuitions be quietly reformed by the discovery that we are here at all. In this light, the woman discovering her true paternity might find that her anger, rather than being invalidated by the logic of non-identity, becomes reframed as something else entirely. Not a complaint that she was wronged, but a grief that the story she inherited about herself was built on a fiction, a sorrow that belongs not to the realm of desert or blame, but to the simple human need for truth about where we come from, a need that exists independent of whether anyone could have done otherwise. And in this reframing, we might see that the deepest moral failures are not those that violate a logic of identity in desert, but rather those that deny us the truth of our own origins, that treat us as though we can be sustained by comfortable fictions when we are creatures who hunger, perhaps above all else, for an honest accounting of how we came to be. This hunger for truth may itself be the only solid ground we have, not a logical argument that survives philosophical scrutiny, but a human need that persists regardless of whether identity logic can justify it, and in honoring that need, we honor something more fundamental than consistency. Imagine you are dying of thirst in the desert, and a stranger in a car offers you a ride to the nearest town where you can find water and survive, but only on one condition: that you promise to give him $1,000 once you arrive safely and have recovered from your dehydration. You agree desperately, and he drives you to town, and you drink water and feel better, and now you face the decision of whether to actually pay him the money you promised. The question becomes, do you have any rational reason to pay him now that you no longer need the ride, now that the transaction is complete and he cannot punish you for breaking your word because you are already safe? From a purely self-interested perspective in that moment, paying the money makes you worse off than keeping it, yet you find yourself genuinely torn about whether you should honor your commitment. This is Parfit's Hitchhiker, a thought experiment that reveals something profound about human rationality and decision-making that we rarely acknowledge in our daily lives. The puzzle works because it exposes a fracture in how we think about motivation and self-interest across time. When you made the promise in the desert, you were a different version of yourself with different urgent needs and different incentives, and that version of you made a commitment that the current version of you, the hydrated and safe version, must now decide whether to honor. The hitchhiker's gamble was that your future self would be the kind of person who keeps promises, and by accepting the ride, you implicitly agreed to be that kind of person. But now that the future is here, it seems like the rational choice would be to abandon that identity and simply keep your money. Yet something in us resists this logic, something that recognizes that if we become people who break promises whenever it becomes convenient, then we become people that others will not help in future moments of desperation. The mechanism underlying this dilemma is that our commitments and our reputations and our character traits are bound together across time in ways that pure moment-to-moment calculations cannot capture. If you are known to be someone who keeps their promises even when it costs you, then people will be more willing to help you in moments of genuine need, which makes your commitment-keeping behavior actually rational in the deepest sense. But only if you can genuinely commit to being that kind of person, even when it would benefit you not to be. We live inside this paradox constantly without really noticing it, because we understand intuitively that the person we are today must be someone that our future selves will want to be. And that means making choices now that constrain our future choices in ways that seem irrational in isolation, but which are deeply rational when viewed as the architecture of a coherent self across time. This is why we feel the pull to pay the hitchhiker even when we know we could escape consequences. We are not just deciding about this transaction, but about what kind of person we are constructing ourselves to be, and that construction is the truest form of rational self-interest there is. The hitchhiker understood this implicitly. He was not really betting on your gratitude or your sense of honor in that moment, but on the fact that you would recognize yourself as the kind of person who cannot afford to be a promise breaker, that your future self would see the payment not as a loss, but but as an investment in the person you need to become. And this is precisely why societies that honor contracts and commitments tend to flourish, while those built on opportunism tend to fragment. The Hitchhiker's wager scales up from individual transactions to the entire fabric of civilization, where every promise kept is a thread that holds the social world together, and every promise broken is a thread that unravels it. When you understand this, you see that the Hitchhiker was never really a stranger at all. He was a mirror showing you yourself, reflecting back the person you claim to be, and asking whether you have the courage to actually become that person when no one is watching and nothing forces your hand. Imagine two drivers, both equally intoxicated, both equally reckless, both speeding through a residential neighborhood at midnight with impaired judgment and slowed reflexes. One driver hits a pothole and swerves safely into an empty street, arriving home without incident, where they sleep peacefully and wake the next morning with only a hangover and no memory of their dangerous drive. The other driver, traveling the same speed on the same street at nearly the same time, strikes a child who was crossing to retrieve a ball, causing catastrophic injuries that will define that child's life and the lives of everyone connected to them. Both drivers made identical choices based on identical mental states and identical levels of culpability in the moment of decision, and yet one will face criminal charges, decades of imprisonment, and a permanent moral condemnation that will follow them forever, while the other will never face consequences because fortune intervened before they could cause harm. This is moral luck, the deeply troubling phenomenon wherein the moral evaluation of our actions depends not on our intentions or our character or our actual decision-making process, but rather on factors entirely beyond our control, circumstances we could never have predicted or prevented. The mechanism operates on a simple but devastating principle. We naturally judge actions by their outcomes rather than their inputs, and since outcomes depend partly on luck and circumstance, our moral judgments become contaminated by elements that have nothing to do with the agent's actual wrongdoing or virtue. The intoxicated driver who causes harm seems more morally culpable than the intoxicated driver who causes no harm, even though their culpability in choosing to drive intoxicated was identical, because we cannot help but weight the visible consequences more heavily than the invisible near misses that might have occurred. We do this constantly in countless domains. The surgeon whose patient dies on the operating table from a complication beyond the surgeon's control faces professional and moral judgment that a surgeon whose patient survives an identical operation with identical technique will never encounter. The businessman whose company collapses due to an unforeseen market crash becomes a symbol of incompetence, while another businessman whose company thrives despite equally dubious decisions becomes celebrated as a visionary. The student who plagiarizes a single sentence and gets caught receives permanent academic consequences, while the student who plagiarizes an entire paper and never gets caught graduates with honors. We have somehow normalized this absurd system where virtue and wickedness are partially determined by dice rolls and timing and the random distribution of attention. And we continue to construct entire moral and legal systems around this contaminated foundation, judging people as if their actions occurred in a vacuum where luck played no role. Yet perhaps the deepest tragedy of moral luck is not merely that we judge unfairly, but that this unfairness is nearly impossible to correct. We cannot see the accidents that didn't happen, cannot quantify the dangers that were averted, and so we remain forever trapped in a moral reality constructed from visible outcomes rather than actual choices, condemning some for the misfortune of being caught in circumstances they shared with the fortunate, who escape judgment simply because their recklessness happened to encounter empty streets instead of children. This is why we struggle so deeply with questions of justice and fairness, not because we lack the capacity for moral reasoning, but because we have built our entire ethical framework on the assumption that we control outcomes when in fact we control only our intentions, and intentions invisible to the world carry almost no weight in the court of public judgment or law. We see this most acutely in how we judge historical figures, condemning them for failing to prevent harms they couldn't foresee while celebrating others who benefited from moral progress they did nothing to create, and in how we construct our own self-narratives, feeling secretly ashamed of near disasters we narrowly escaped while taking credit for successes that depended heavily on circumstances we were born into rather thaw. Consider the person who finds themselves perpetually overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon them, whether by employers, family members, social institutions, or even self-imposed standards that have calcified into seemingly immovable requirements. And yet when they attempt to push back against these demands or propose alternatives, they encounter a peculiar form of resistance that suggests their objection is somehow unreasonable, excessive, or indicative of a character flaw rather than a legitimate concern about the sustainability of their own well-being. The demandingness objection operates as a conversational silencer, a rhetorical move that reframes any resistance to increasing burdens as though the person objecting is the problem rather than the system making those demands, transforming a reasonable assertion of human limits into something that sounds vaguely selfish or entitled when stated aloud. The mechanism at work here involves a subtle inversion of responsibility where the person being asked to do more, work longer hours, sacrifice further, or extend themselves beyond previous boundaries, is somehow positioned as unreasonable for suggesting that there exists a point at which their capacity genuinely maxes out, as though human beings possess infinite bandwidth and any claim otherwise represents a failure of commitment or character. What persists despite the obvious logical problems with this framework is a widespread cultural narrative suggesting that the most virtuous path involves accepting whatever demands come your way without complaint. That resilience means accommodating yourself endlessly to external pressures, and that suggesting something is unsustainable amounts to weakness rather than basic mathematics. We have normalized the objection to objections themselves, creating a world where people can describe feeling stretched impossibly thin while simultaneously being made to feel guilty for naming that reality, where the person drowning is somehow the unreasonable one for suggesting the water level might be too high, and where systemic demands that exceed human capacity persist largely because those affected by them have been convinced that their discomfort is a personal failure rather than evidence that the system itself requires examination and fundamental change. The result is a kind of learned helplessness dressed up as virtue, where people internalize the message that their exhaustion is something to be managed privately through better time management or more disciplined self-care, rather than something that signals a legitimate need for systemic change, and where the burden of accommodation falls entirely on those already stretched to their breaking point, rather than on the systems and institutions that created the impossible situation in the first place. This sleight of hand serves a crucial function for those benefiting from unsustainable arrangements. It allows excessive demands to persist indefinitely while positioning resistance not as a rational response to an impossible situation, but as evidence of individual inadequacy, ensuring that the conversation never shifts toward examining whether the demands themselves might be fundamentally unreasonable. By structuring the conversation this way, where objecting to demands becomes the focal point rather than the demands themselves, institutions can extract maximum effort from people while maintaining plausible deniability about whether those expectations were ever reasonable to begin with. And individuals internalize a permanent sense that they simply haven't yet discovered the right combination of productivity hacks or motivational frameworks that would allow them to finally meet all their obligations without complaint. The insidious promise embedded in this arrangement is that adequacy remains perpetually just out of reach, that with one more optimization, one more sacrifice, one more recalibration of priorities, the impossible will finally become manageable, when in fact the mathematical reality is that no amount of personal effort can stretch a finite resource into an infinite one, and the system depends entirely on this belief persisting. Consider a moment when you observe something factual about the world and then immediately draw a conclusion about what should be done, as though the observation itself contains an instruction built into its very fabric, and this happens so naturally that you rarely pause to notice the leap you have just made. You might observe that most people in your society work full-time jobs, and from this fact you feel compelled to conclude that you ought to do the same, or you might notice that your peers are getting married and establishing families, and somehow this observation transforms into a sense of obligation, as though the mere existence of a pattern in the world around you has somehow generated a moral imperative for your own behavior. The Violinist problem, first formally articulated by the philosopher David Hume in the 18th century, describes precisely this phenomenon, the seemingly unbridgeable gap between what is true about the world and what we believe we should do about it. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple yet profoundly difficult to escape, because our minds perform a kind of automatic translation between observations and values, between descriptive facts and normative principles without any logical bridge to justify this translation. When you see that something exists, or that something is done commonly, or that something is considered successful by others, your brain generates a corresponding sense of ought, a moral weight, an obligation or aspiration that feels as though it has been extracted directly from reality itself, when in fact no logical rule has ever been established that permits us to move from the realm of facts into the realm of values. The persistence of this mental habit, despite its logical indefensibility, suggests something important about how human consciousness actually operates in practice. For we cannot seem to perceive the world without simultaneously generating judgments about what ought to be, and we cannot seem to motivate ourselves to action without feeling that our choices reflect some deeper truth about how things should be rather than merely how they are. This conflation has become so normalized in human experience that we rarely recognize it as a logical error at all, instead treating it as an obvious and natural consequence of understanding anything whatsoever about the structure of reality. Yet this naturalized confusion serves a function. It allows us to navigate social life without constant paralysis, to feel motivated and oriented rather than adrift in a sea of mere facts, and to coordinate our behavior with others around shared understandings of how life should be lived, even though those understandings rest on logical ground that cannot ultimately bear the weight we have placed upon it. The question then becomes not whether we can escape this gap, we cannot, but whether we can at least become conscious of it, recognizing in each moment when we are making the leap from observation to obligation, and perhaps choosing more deliberately which facts we allow to generate which values, rather than surrendering entirely to the automatic translations our minds perform. When you notice yourself feeling that you ought to pursue a particular career because it is lucrative, or that you ought to adopt certain values because they are fashionable in your community, you create a small space of freedom, a moment in which the automatic translation can be examined rather than simply obeyed, and in which you might discover that what felt like an inevitable moral truth was actually just a fact about the world dressed up in the language of obligation. This capacity for metacognitive distance, to observe your own moral intuitions as they form, is perhaps the closest we can come to bridging Hume's gap, not by discovering a logical rule that connects facts to values, but by recognizing that the translation itself is a choice we make again and again, moment by moment, and that this recognition alone offers us something genuine, not escape from the Azot problem, but agency within it. To practice this recognition is to begin noticing how often you internalize the implicit ought embedded in a news story, an advertisement, or a friend's success, and to ask yourself whether that particular translation serves your actual values or. Consider the moment when someone asks you what you believe your perfect duty or ultimate obligation in life should be, and you realize that whatever answer you provide will inevitably contradict some other deeply held value you possess, creating a logical paradox that cannot be resolved through rational thought alone. If you say your perfect duty is to your family, then you immediately confront the question of whether you are neglecting your duties to society, to your work, to your health, or to your own personal development and growth. If you say your perfect duty is to yourself and your own flourishing, you must then reconcile this with the instinctive human need to care for others and contribute to something larger than yourself. If you claim your perfect duty is to truth and knowledge, you will encounter situations where telling the truth causes harm, where pursuing knowledge requires resources that could feed the hungry, where the search for understanding conflicts with the need for action and decisiveness in urgent moments. The psychological mechanism at work here involves what philosophers call the problem of incommensurable values, a condition where multiple legitimate goods cannot be simultaneously maximized, forcing us to choose between authentic moral commitments without any objective framework to determine which choice is correct. We experience this tension throughout our entire lives, yet we have developed a curious social habit of speaking as though our duties have some natural hierarchy, some logical ordering that makes sense, when in fact we are simply performing a kind of cultural ritual that allows us to function without acknowledging the underlying contradiction. We teach our children that they should follow their dreams and also honor their families, that they should be ambitious but also humble, that they should care for themselves but also be selfless, and we present these as compatible goals when deep philosophical examination reveals they are fundamentally in tension. What makes this question particularly insidious is that the moment you stop trying to answer it rationally, the moment you simply accept that no perfect duty exists and that life requires navigating constant moral ambiguity, you find a strange kind of peace that our culture neither acknowledges nor celebrates. Yet this peace itself becomes suspect the moment we examine it closely, for accepting moral ambiguity might simply be another form of rationalization, another way of avoiding the harder work of actually choosing and committing, of accepting that some duties will remain perpetually neglected no matter how thoughtfully we deliberate. Perhaps this is why the question itself matters more than any answer, not because it leads us toward truth, but because the asking keeps us honest about the impossibility of living without moral compromise, preventing us from ever fully settling into the comfortable illusion that our choices are anything other than what they are. Imperfect selections among competing goods, each one a small betrayal of something we also genuinely value. And yet we continue to ask the question anyway, driven by something deeper than logic. A stubborn human refusal to accept that meaning might be constructed rather than discovered, that we might be responsible for creating the very hierarchy of duties we desperately wish we could find already written into the structure of the universe. This act of creation, choosing what matters most without cosmic permission, might itself be the only duty that truly deserves the name perfect, not because it solves the paradox, but because it acknowledges that we are the ones who must live inside it, moment by moment, without the comfort of external validation or ultimate justification. The parent who stays late at work to provide for their child while missing their recital, the activist who sacrifices personal relationships for a cause, the artist who chooses creation over security, each performs this quiet act of self-authorship, constructing meaning through absence as much as through presence, teaching us by their example that perfection lies not in resolving the paradox, but in bearing witness to it with full consciousness and deliberate choice. Consider the philosophical problem that emerges when we ask whether it is better to create a world with many people living reasonably good lives, or a world with fewer people living exceptionally good lives. And notice how this question has no satisfying answer despite being fundamental to how we should think about the future of humanity. The real-world manifestation of this dilemma appears constantly in policy decisions about resource allocation, environmental protection, and family planning, where governments and individuals must implicitly answer whether they value the total amount of happiness in existence or the average quality of life experienced by each individual within that existence. If we prioritize total happiness, we seem committed to the conclusion that we should maximize population as long as lives are worth living, which intuitively feels wrong because it suggests we should breed vastly more humans into mediocre circumstances rather than allowing fewer people to flourish in abundance. Yet if we instead prioritize average happiness and refuse to create new lives unless they exceed our current quality of life standard, we find ourselves unable to justify why we should care about future generations at all, or why bringing any new person into the world could ever be ethically defensible when non-existence harms no one. The psychological mechanism sustaining this impossible problem lies in our simultaneous commitment to two irreconcilable moral intuitions: the belief that creating happy lives is intrinsically good, and the belief that we have special obligations to make those who already exist as happy as possible. We are caught between competing moral frameworks that each seem reasonable in isolation, but become incoherent when combined, forcing us to make population decisions that reflect whichever intuition we happen to prioritize in any given moment. What makes this philosophical puzzle so persistent despite its logical intractability is that humanity must continue making reproductive and resource allocation decisions whether or not we have answered the underlying ethical question. So we have simply developed the capacity to act decisively while remaining fundamentally uncertain about whether our actions are correct. Allowing civilization to proceed through demographic transitions and policy choices that rest on unstated and contradictory assumptions about what makes a life worth creating. This uncertainty reveals itself most starkly in the gap between our environmental policies, which often implicitly assume we should constrain population growth to protect existing flourishing, and our social safety net policies, which treat child-rearing as a fundamental right deserving public support, contradictory commitments that expose how population ethics remains fundamentally unresolved even as we collectively enact it through law and resource distribution. The persistence of this contradiction suggests that population ethics may be less a problem awaiting logical resolution and more a permanent feature of moral life, one that requires us to make peace with acting on incomplete understanding, acknowledging that any population policy we adopt will inevitably privilege certain values while sacrificing others, and that the mark of ethical maturity in this domain may lie not in discovering the right answer, but in consciously choosing which moral intuitions to honor while remaining transparently aware of what we are leaving behind. This means that a parent deciding whether to have a child or a nation deciding whether to encourage immigration is not actually solving an ethical puzzle, but performing an act of moral commitment, choosing what kind of world they want to inhabit and help create, knowing that no choice will satisfy all reasonable ethical demands, and that their decision will inevitably reveal which human values they have decided matter most. In this light, the question that matters most is not whether we have justified our population choices theoretically, but whether we have been honest with ourselves about what we are choosing and why, whether we can articulate, with clarity and humility, which futures we are willing to sacrifice and which forms of human flourishing we have decided are worth the cost of constraining others. Consider the peculiar situation in which we find ourselves when making decisions that affect people who do not yet exist, those future generations who will inherit the consequences of our current choices, and ask yourself whether we bear any genuine responsibility to them at all. We make policies about carbon emissions, nuclear waste storage, infrastructure investment, and resource depletion with the knowledge that people born decades or centuries from now will experience the results. Yet we struggle profoundly with the logical question of whether these non-existent people have any claim on our moral consideration right now. The mechanism underlying this confusion stems from a fundamental asymmetry in our thinking. We can affect future people through our actions, but they cannot affect us back. They cannot vote, they cannot negotiate, they cannot even communicate their preferences to us, and this creates a strange philosophical void where our intuitions about obligation and rights simply do not have solid ground to stand upon. We know that if we dump toxic materials into the earth, future generations will suffer, yet we ask ourselves whether people who do not exist yet can be wronged, whether non-existent people have interests that we are obligated to protect, whether our duty to future people is the same as our duty to present people, and these questions have no clean answers despite centuries of philosophical investigation. What persists throughout this logical confusion is a kind of middle ground practice in which we act as though future people matter, without actually committing to why they matter or how much they matter relative to our own immediate needs and desires. And we have somehow normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that most societies continue making irreversible environmental and financial decisions, while simultaneously expressing concern about their impact on posterity. We build institutions and policies that assume future people deserve consideration, yet we consistently discount their welfare in favor of present economic gain. We promise to preserve resources for them while depleting them. We acknowledge the problem while perpetuating the behavior that creates it, and this persistent gap between our stated values and our actual choices continues uninterrupted because the future people in question cannot hold us accountable, cannot protest, cannot even exist to remind us that our promises matter. The tragedy deepens when we recognize that this powerlessness is not accidental but structural. Future people's absence from the present conversation is precisely what allows us to justify postponing costly solutions, to treat their interests as negotiable rather than binding, and to frame sustainability as a luxury we might pursue if it does not interfere with quarterly profits or electoral cycles. In this way, non-existence becomes an excuse rather than a constraint, and the future people problem reveals itself as less a philosophical puzzle and more a convenient permission slip we have written for ourselves. Yet the darkest irony may be that we possess the intellectual capacity to recognize this permission slip for what it is, to understand the mechanism of our own moral evasion, and still find ourselves unable or unwilling to alter course, suggesting that the future people problem is ultimately not a failure of philosophy, but a failure of collective will, a choice disguised as inevitability. And so we continue to optimize for the present moment, rationing our moral urgency as though future generations were merely a statistical abstraction rather than the inevitable inheritors of our decisions, while knowing full well that this abdication of responsibility will someday be recognized as one of the great moral failures of our age, a failure not of understanding, but of courage. Perhaps the most unsettling recognition is that future generations will likely possess even greater technological capability than we do, making our current inaction not merely negligent but actively insulting. We choose constraint not because we lack the means to act, but because we lack the will to sacrifice present comfort for their survival, effectively telling them that our convenience was worth more than their existence. Consider the fundamental paradox that underlies one of humanity's most consequential decisions, the choice to bring a new conscious being into existence. When two people decide to have a child, they are making an irreversible commitment that will shape the life of someone who had no say in the matter, who cannot consent to being born, and who will inevitably experience suffering alongside whatever joys their life might contain. Yet this decision is almost universally treated as a personal choice, a natural right, even a profound expression of love and hope for the future. The person being created cannot be asked whether they wish to exist, cannot weigh the potential benefits against the guaranteed hardships, and cannot decline participation in a life that might involve pain, illness, loss, disappointment, and ultimately death. This is perhaps the only significant decision in human affairs where the most affected party is completely excluded from the decision-making process. The psychological mechanism that allows this contradiction to persist operates through several interconnected layers of normalization and selective attention. We are biologically and culturally programmed to desire parenthood and to view reproduction as fundamentally good, which creates a powerful cognitive bias that prevents us from fully examining the ethical implications of our choices. We tend to focus on the potential happiness a child might experience while unconsciously minimizing or discounting the suffering that is statistically inevitable. We use language like legacy, continuing the family line, and ensuring the future to frame procreation in positive terms that obscure the underlying reality of imposing existence upon another being. Society reinforces these patterns constantly through institutions, media, and social expectations that treat having children as a natural progression rather than an ethically complex decision. Perhaps most significantly, we have survived as a species precisely because we do not fully confront this paradox, because our decision-making about reproduction operates more on instinct and cultural momentum than on rigorous ethical analysis. The very act of being born has made us biased in favor of existence, since we cannot ask those who were never born whether they would have preferred that outcome. And so this impossible question persists in the background of human consciousness, rarely examined directly, yet somehow managing to be the source of new consciousness itself. Perhaps this is why the question of procreation remains perpetually unresolved. It requires us to stand outside existence itself to evaluate it fairly, a position no living person can truly occupy. We are asked to make the most consequential ethical decision of all while standing firmly within the very system we are being asked to judge. Yet this paradox has generated no shortage of philosophical responses. From those who argue that life's intrinsic value justifies procreation regardless of suffering, to antinatalists who contend that creating suffering requires moral justification we cannot provide, to pragmatists who simply accept that humans will continue reproducing because the drive to do so is too deeply embedded in our nature to be reasoned away. What remains constant across all these positions is the acknowledgement that something genuinely troubling lurks beneath the surface of one of humanity's most ordinary decisions. Perhaps this is why we rarely speak of procreation in these terms, why the language of choice and consent feels almost transgressive when applied to reproduction, why suggesting that creating life requires moral justification can provoke defensiveness rather than reflection. The unexamined nature of this paradox may itself be essential to its continuation. Yet in this very silence, we might find something worth preserving, the recognition that some of our most meaningful decisions exist beyond the reach of pure rationality, and that perhaps the inability to fully justify procreation ethically is not a failure of reasoning, but rather evidence that we are navigating something that transcends the categories through which we normally make moral sense of the world. Imagine a future where cognitive enhancement becomes widely available through safe, affordable means, perhaps through pharmaceutical intervention, genetic modification, or neural implants that genuinely work without significant side effects, and consider the peculiar ethical position this creates in society. If enhancement technology becomes commonplace, the choice to remain unenhanced gradually transforms from a neutral default into an active decision that carries increasing social and economic consequences. Much like how choosing not to learn to read or use email has become a deliberate handicap in the modern world, rather than a simple lifestyle preference. The mechanism underlying this dilemma operates through what we might call competitive relativism, where an individual advantage becomes meaningful only in comparison to others, so that widespread enhancement essentially resets the baseline of normal human capability and renders the previously unenhanced into a disadvantaged group, not because they have declined, but because everyone else has advanced. This creates a cascade of pressure where refusing enhancement eventually becomes not a philosophical stance, but a practical liability, as educational opportunities, employment prospects, and social mobility increasingly favor those with enhanced cognition, leaving the unenhanced not equal but demonstrably behind in measurable ways that compound over decades. What makes this question particularly troubling for ethical consideration is that no individual person acting rationally needs to do anything wrong. Each person might reasonably choose enhancement purely for self-improvement and competitive necessity rather than to harm others. Yet the collective result of millions of individually reasonable choices produces a system where enhancement becomes mandatory in practice rather than optional in theory, effectively eliminating genuine human choice through the aggregation of rational self-interest. We have normalized versions of this already with education, where attending college shifts from advantage to requirement, where attending the right college shifts from good fortune to expectation, and where various credentials and certifications compound throughout life such that opting out at any stage closes doors that become progressively harder to reopen. Yet the crucial difference with cognitive enhancement is the speed and totality of the transition. Educational credential stacking unfolds over decades with multiple exit and reentry points, whereas neurological enhancement could compress similar competitive pressures into years, potentially locking an advantage before society even recognizes what has been lost, and offering no natural mechanism for those left behind to catch up once the enhancement gap becomes biological rather than merely institutional. The paradox deepens when we consider that the most ethically conscientious people, those who hesitate about enhancement on principle, may be precisely those least likely to have their voices heard in a society increasingly composed of the enhanced, whose cognitive advantages grant them greater influence over the very policies that will determine whether enhancement remains optional or becomes effectively mandatory for the next generation. This creates a form of democratic erosion not through authoritarianism, but through the invisible hand of market forces and individual choice, where the unenhanced find themselves governed by policies shaped by minds operating at a different cognitive level, unable to fully participate in the deliberations that will determine their own future. A situation where consent becomes increasingly theoretical even as it remains procedurally intact. The question then becomes not whether enhancement is ethical in isolated cases, but whether a society can maintain meaningful democratic self-determination once cognitive enhancement becomes sufficiently widespread to reshape the intellectual landscape that all future deliberations must occur within, and whether we can devise governance structures that preserve genuine choice about enhancement itself before that choice becomes merely theoretical. Consider the peculiar position in which modern civilization finds itself when contemplating its own future, caught between two seemingly incompatible catastrophes that cannot logically coexist, yet somehow occupy the same anxious mental space without resolution. On one side stands the prospect of complete extinction, the total cessation of human life through mechanisms both familiar and speculative, nuclear war, unchecked climate collapse, engineered pandemics, asteroid impact, or some unforeseen cascading system failure that erases our species entirely from the planetary stage. On the other side exists the dystopian future, wherein humanity persists but in conditions of such degradation, surveillance, inequality, environmental ruin, or totalitarian control that existence becomes a prolonged suffering rather than a meaningful continuation. The psychological mechanism at work here involves a fundamental inability to assign relative probability or preference to these futures, for to prefer extinction might seem cowardly or defeatist, yet to prefer dystopia might seem naively optimistic or morally corrupt. The human mind recoils equally from both possibilities while simultaneously dwelling upon them with almost obsessive frequency, as though the very act of imagining these futures might somehow prevent them through some magical logic of acknowledgement. What makes this particularly strange is that these two categories are not actually competitors in the way we intuitively treat them, for dystopia is technically a subset of continued existence, and extinction would render all dystopian concerns irrelevant, yet we maintain anxiety about both with equal fervor. This paradox persists because the question itself forces an impossible choice that reveals the deeper human struggle with uncertainty and control. We want simultaneously to believe that catastrophe is avoidable through our choices, while also believing that catastrophe is inevitable, and we construct elaborate mental frameworks in which both contradictory certainties can coexist peacefully. Perhaps this is why our cultural narratives so often feature lone survivors navigating wastelands or resistance fighters opposing oppressive regimes. These stories allow us to collapse the distinction, imagining extinction as selective affecting them rather than us, and dystopia as temporarily survivable, thereby granting our anxious minds the fiction of agency in a future where agency may prove illusory. Yet the cruelest irony may be that this psychological need for narrative agency, this insistence that survival stories matter and resistance is meaningful, might itself be the only thing that prevents us from accelerating toward either endpoint, even as it blinds us to the possibility that the choice between extinction and dystopia was never truly ours to make in the first place. Perhaps what we are actually choosing between then is not the future itself, but rather the story we tell about our agency within it. And in that sense, both extinction and dystopia become less prophecies to prevent and more narratives through which we attempt to maintain the illusion of meaningful deliberation in an increasingly complex system that may have already determined its own trajectory independent of our anxieties about it. In this light, the endless debate between technological optimists and catastrophists reveals itself as less a genuine disagreement about futures and more a shared ritual through which we collectively process our helplessness, each side offering a different narrative permission structure for continuing to act as though our choices matter. The comfort of either position, that we can engineer our way to utopia, or conversely, that collapse is inevitable and therefore not our responsibility, may ultimately be more psychologically necessary than any accuracy they might possess. And so we find ourselves performing elaborate rituals of concern, carbon footprint calculators, protest attendance, investment in renewable energy, that serve primarily to confirm our participation in the system rather than our power to alter it, a distinction we cannot afford to examine too closely lest the entire psychological scaffolding collapse and leave us facing the truly unbearable question, whether our paralysis between these two futures I. Consider the moment when you attempt to examine your own thinking process in real time, the peculiar situation where the very act of analyzing how your mind works fundamentally alters the thing you are trying to observe, much like a scientist studying the behavior of particles only to discover that the act of measurement itself changes their behavior. Except in this case, the scientist is both the instrument and the subject simultaneously. When you pause mid-thought to analyze why you are thinking in a particular way, you have already shifted your mental state away from the authentic thought pattern you were attempting to understand, because the conscious attention required to observe your thinking automatically pulls you out of the spontaneous flow of thought and places you into a meta-analytical mode that operates according to different rules and patterns. This creates an impossible situation where the most honest access you could have to your own cognition is perpetually obscured by the very mechanism of consciousness that enables you to think about thinking in the first place, rendering perfect self-knowledge logically impossible rather than merely difficult. The psychologist attempting to study their own biases becomes biased by the attempt. The writer trying to understand their own creative process interrupts the creative process in the moment of examination. The person analyzing their own anxiety about a social situation often finds that the analysis itself becomes a new source of anxiety, layer upon layer of distortion introduced by the recursive nature of consciousness examining itself. Yet we continue to engage in this fundamentally paradoxical activity throughout our lives, spending enormous amounts of time and resources trying to understand ourselves, despite the built-in logical contradiction that understanding requires a distance from the thing being understood. And when you achieve that distance, you are no longer examining the original thing, but rather a representation of it filtered through analytical consciousness. We have normalized this impossible task so completely that we rarely acknowledge the fundamental strangeness of it, teaching children to reflect on their feelings and their learning processes as though these were straightforward activities rather than recursive logical paradoxes. encouraging therapy and self-examination, as though the examining self could somehow step outside of its own nature to gain objective clarity about its own nature. The acceptance of this paradox seems to require us to abandon the classical logic that says something cannot simultaneously be both the observer and the observed, both the tool of measurement and the thing being measured, suggesting perhaps that human consciousness operates in a realm where such contradictions are simply the baseline conditions of existence rather than errors to be resolved. Perhaps this is why the most profound self-understanding often comes not from direct introspection, but from oblique approaches, through art, through conversation with others who reflect us back to ourselves, through the unconscious wisdom that emerges when we stop trying so hard to see ourselves clearly and simply allow ourselves to exist and be witnessed. In this way, the paradox resolves itself not through logic, but through surrender. The moment you stop insisting that your awareness must perfectly capture itself, you become free to know yourself through the very living of your life, as though the self were always most visible in its unreflective action rather than in its studied observation. And yet the paradox reasserts itself the moment you recognize this truth, because in understanding that surrender resolves the impossible task, you have analyzed your way to the conclusion that analysis itself is the obstacle, creating a final loop where even the escape from the paradox becomes another form of the paradox, suggesting that perhaps the point was never to resolve it, but to develop the wisdom to live gracefully within its inescapable contradiction. This graceful living within paradox might be the most honest form of self-knowledge available to us, not the clarity we sought, but the wisdom to recognize that the seeking itself, with all its circular contradictions, is the authentic expression of what it means to be. Imagine you step into a chamber designed to deconstruct your body at the molecular level, scan every atom and synapse, and reconstruct you perfectly at a destination miles away. Yet the moment the process completes, you become uncertain whether the consciousness that experiences the arrival is actually you or simply a perfect copy that believes itself to be you while your original self ceased to exist the instant the deconstruction began. This is the philosophical paradox that haunts the Teletransporter Problem, a thought experiment that reveals something deeply unsettling about personal identity and continuity of consciousness. When we consider the mechanics of such a device, we find ourselves caught between two incompatible understandings of what makes us who we are. If consciousness is purely a product of physical arrangement, of neural patterns and chemical signatures, then a perfect molecular recreation should be indistinguishable from the original. Yet our intuition rebels against this conclusion with a visceral certainty that feels immune to logical argument. The psychological mechanism operating here involves what philosophers call the branching identity problem, where we recognize that the copied version at the destination will have every memory, every personality trait, every sense of continuous selfhood that the original possessed. And yet we cannot escape the unsettling notion that if the original body is destroyed, something irreplaceable is lost. Some essential thread of experiential continuity that no amount of perfect duplication can preserve. This anxiety persists not because we have disproven the theory of copying, but because our minds are fundamentally structured to experience identity as a continuous thread extending backward through time, and the teletransporter breaks that thread decisively, forcing us to acknowledge that perhaps our sense of persistent self is not as real or unbroken as we instinctively believe it to be. What makes this paradox particularly resistant to resolution is that we have normalized similar discontinuities in our actual existence without recognizing them. For sleep disrupts consciousness entirely, yet we wake believing we are the same person. Anesthesia erases hours of experience, yet we accept the gap without existential dread. And the atoms in our bodies replace themselves over years, yet we claim continuous identity through the passage of time. The teletransporter merely renders visible and instantaneous the philosophical problem that already lurks within the structure of human existence, transforming a gradual and invisible process into something sudden and undeniable, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that personal identity might be far more fragile and constructed than we have ever admitted to ourselves. Yet perhaps the deepest discomfort arises not from the logical impossibility of resolving the paradox, but from the suspicion that our resistance to accepting the copy as ourselves reveals something we would prefer to ignore, that the self we cling to so desperately might be nothing more than a useful fiction, a story our brains tell themselves to create the illusion of continuity where, in truth, only patterns and processes persist. And if we accept this conclusion, that identity is narrative rather than metaphysical. Then the teletransporter becomes not a malfunction at all, but a perfect mirror held up to the truth we have always obscured. That you are dying and being reborn with every moment, that the continuity you feel is an elegant construction of memory rather than an unbroken stream of experience, and that the copy at the destination is as much you as the original ever was, because you was always a process, never a thing. This realization offers a strange comfort. If identity is process rather than possession, then the teletransporter's apparent cruelty becomes indistinguishable from the ordinary cruelty of existence itself. And stepping into that chamber differs only in its honesty from the slow dissolution we undergo with every breath, every thought, every moment we mistake for continuity. Consider the experience of someone who has made a difficult ethical choice, perhaps declining to help a person in need because they genuinely lack the resources to do so, or choosing between two obligations when only one could be fulfilled, or making a decision that benefited themselves but caused minor harm to someone else despite being justified. Even after the person rationally convinces themselves that their choice was correct, necessary, and fully justified by the circumstances, they often experience a lingering sense of moral discomfort, guilt, or unease that persists for hours or even days. This phenomenon, sometimes called moral residue, describes the emotional aftermath that clings to us despite logical absolvement. The peculiar aspect of moral residue is that it seems to operate entirely independently of whether we actually did anything wrong. A person might intellectually understand with complete certainty that their decision was the most ethical option available to them, that they acted with integrity, that they made the choice any reasonable person would have made under identical circumstances, and yet the uncomfortable feeling remains, like a stain that logic cannot quite wash away. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to involve a disconnect between our rational mind and our emotional systems. Our logical faculties can evaluate a situation, weigh consequences, consider duties and rights, and arrive at a justified conclusion. But our emotional architecture, which evolved over millions of years and is deeply tied to our social nature and capacity for empathy, continues to register that someone suffered or that we were involved in a harmful outcome, regardless of whether our involvement was necessary or blameless. The emotional system does not easily accept the verdict of the rational system, as though feeling and reason operate on different wavelengths that only partially overlap. Over time, we have largely normalized this experience, treating it as simply part of the human condition rather than investigating how strange it truly is that we should feel guilty for making correct decisions or feel morally compromised by unavoidable dilemmas. We give this sensation names and categories, we write about it in psychology textbooks and philosophy journals, we acknowledge it in conversations about ethics, and in doing so we have made it seem almost natural that our conscience should punish us even when we have done nothing wrong, as if the moral discomfort itself proves something about our character rather than something about the curious architecture of human emotion and judgment. Yet perhaps this residue serves a function we have not fully appreciated. It may be the price of having a conscience at all, a necessary friction that keeps us from becoming too comfortable with harm, even when that harm was justified or unavoidable. In this view, moral residue is not a flaw in our emotional design, but rather evidence that we remain beings for whom the suffering of others genuinely matters, regardless of our rational culpability. Without this residue, we might become the kind of people who can rationalize away any harm with perfect logical justification, losing touch with the fundamental empathy that makes ethical reasoning meaningful in the first place. The discomfort, then, may be less a sign of moral failure and more a sign of moral success, evidence that our humanity has not been entirely subordinated to our rationality. Yet we rarely pause to ask whether this discomfort itself deserves moral consideration, whether ignoring it in the name of rational justification might itself be a kind of ethical blindness, a failure to listen to what our emotional wisdom is trying to tell us about the weight of our choices and our place in a world where perfect solutions rarely exist. Perhaps what moral residue ultimately reveals is that the most ethically mature response to such dilemmas is not to eliminate the discomfort through rationalization, but to sit with it, to let it inform how we approach similar choices in the future, to remain humbled by the recognition that living well sometimes means accepting that we will carry the weight of unavoidable harms, and to use that weight as a compass rather than as evidence of failure.